Pues creo que llevamos como unos 5 o 10 minutos de retraso, pero bueno, ha sido por todo el tema de la traducción simultánea. Daros la bienvenida a todos y a todas al arranque de este ciclo de periodismo profundo que vamos a estar llevando a cabo en Media Lab durante los próximos días, durante la próxima semana. Arrancamos este fin de semana, ya lo sabéis, con el seminario, que tendremos un par de ciclos de presentaciones y conversatorios entre hoy, arrancamos ahora de 5 a 8, aunque a lo mejor nos alargaremos un poco, y luego la segunda sesión la tendremos mañana, de 12 a 3. Y para los que no lo sepáis, también la semana que viene, del lunes y martes, tendremos unos talleres con Adam Harvey y el miércoles, jueves y viernes otro taller con Cristo Buschek. Daros la bienvenida. Para los que no lo sepáis, Seminario Periodismo Profundo es uno de los talleres transversales que en Media Lab estamos llevando a cabo dentro del ciclo de medios sintientes, que son ciclos, los labs, ¿no? El labs de medios sintientes, que para los que no sepáis, los labs son ciclos trimestrales o cuatrimestrales de distintas actividades donde desde Media Lab de alguna manera como hacemos hincapié en algunas de nuestras líneas de investigación, ¿no? Las 8 líneas de investigación con las que arrancamos en enero de este año. En esta primera ocasión estamos tratando el tema de medios sintientes, en el que estamos lidiando de una manera muy amplia. Es un término que entendemos que puede abarcar una gran cantidad de conceptos, pero de una manera rápida estamos lidiando con la capacidad de los sistemas, de distintos sistemas, tanto tecnológicos, aunque tendremos que replantear lo que significa tecnología, para visibilizar, ¿no? O hacer visible dinámicas que a priori serían invisibles. En ese contexto creemos que el periodismo, que de una manera u otra se dedica precisamente a esto, a visibilizar historias que si no se visibilizasen pues no quedarían como ocultas, era una de las disciplinas con las que queríamos empezar, ¿no? O tratar en este laboratorio. Veréis que lo hacemos desde un punto de vista bastante casi antidisciplinar o interdisciplinar, es decir, para los que ya nos lleváis como siguiendo, sabéis que Media Lab de alguna manera intentamos recoger aquellos proyectos, ¿no? Que no tienen cabida en otros contextos más disciplinares, ¿no? Y que entendemos que son estos puntos entre disciplinas donde emerge de alguna manera la innovación o dinámicas o prácticas que no tienen cabida en otros centros más ortodoxos como pueden ser las universidades o demás sitios más académicos. Para este seminario, no me enrollo mucho más, hemos contado con Marta Pirano, que ha sido la comisaria encargada de trabajar con nosotros en Media Lab para organizar este ciclo de conferencias y los talleres de los que vamos a realizar la próxima semana. Como sabéis, Marta es periodista y escritora, es la autora del libro El enemigo conoce el sistema, que es un bestseller sobre el capitalismo de plataformas, y ahora dentro de poco publicará un nuevo libro, que no sé si podemos decir el título, ¿no? Todavía no, pero bueno, estamos ahí al borde de publicar un nuevo libro, también muy interesante. Y bueno, Marta también ha sido adjunta, ¿no? Al diario.es y ha trabajado en distintas plataformas editoriales y plataformas periodísticas de España y del extranjero. Y bueno, darte las gracias, Marta, por haber trabajado con nosotros estos meses preparando esto. Y bueno, y darte la palabra para que nos presentes qué vamos a ver hoy. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Gracias, Eduardo, por la presentación y gracias a todos por venir un día que verdaderamente no es el magnífico tiempo maravilloso que yo les había vendido a nuestros invitados de hoy. Todo el mundo le digo, ven a Madrid, hace sol cuando en todas partes está lloviendo. Bueno, pues esto no nos ha salido del todo bien, espero que el resto nos salga mejor. Vale, pues un poco la idea de este seminario es para demostrar que el periodismo no está en crisis, aunque los medios de comunicación sí que lo estén, aunque sí que es verdad que ha cambiado. Yo hace muchos años que soy periodista y, bueno, pues puedo atestiguar que ya no hacemos, la mayor parte del tiempo no hacemos el periodismo del Watergate, ¿no? De encontrarnos con gargantas profundas en las 3 de la mañana en garajes de algún universo oscuro paralelo de Washington, pero tampoco es ya el periodismo que hicimos hace unos años, o al menos no solo el periodismo de Enron, ¿no? Que es más un periodismo donde lo que hay que hacer no es buscar datos ocultos, enterrados de fuentes oscuras, sino desenterrar la verdad de grandes cantidades de datos en inmensos que requieren mucho tiempo, mucho esfuerzo y mucha dedicación y conocimiento de periodistas que tienen que estar sentados leyendo papeles y subrayando cosas, ¿no? El periodismo profundo es un concepto que le hemos robado al concepto de tiempo profundo, que es algo que James aquí utiliza para hablar de los tiempos geológicos, que son tiempos que escapan completamente a nuestra comprensión porque son demasiado grandes, ¿no? Podemos entender conceptualmente lo que son 3.000 millones de años, pero no podemos pensarlos porque es absolutamente imposible. Y en este caso, como que cogemos un poco de ese concepto para hablar de un periodismo que se enfrenta no solamente a grandes bases de datos, pues desde filtraciones, ¿no? Como la que vimos en los papeles de Panamá, sino también a los datos que se generan continuamente, la gran máquina de extracción de datos de las plataformas digitales, a la capacidad que tenemos ahora de interrogar no solamente a los individuos implicados en una historia o lo que en periodismo llamábamos las 4 W, ¿no? el qué, cómo, cuándo, quién y dónde, sino que podemos interrogar también espacios, objetos en el tiempo, podemos interrogar escenarios donde hay literalmente paquetes de datos suspendidos, ¿no? Que se pueden visibilizar a través de tecnologías específicas. En general, el periodismo profundo es un periodismo en el que la información por volumen o por estado o por incontinencia casi, ¿no? Por infinitud, escapa a la capacidad del periodista y escapa a la comprensión humana y entonces requiere a menudo herramientas específicas para poder ser gestionada, ¿no? Y entonces, bueno, ahora mismo, por ejemplo, también estamos viendo cómo en espacios donde se ha cerrado el acceso a los acontecimientos, al periodismo, como está pasando ahora mismo en Rusia, pero también en Ucrania, por el mismo motivo, pero de formas distintas, ¿no? Pues ahora mismo, por ejemplo, hay al menos 5 satélites comerciales mirando esos espacios y produciendo mapas que hasta hace, no sé, 5 años estaban solo en manos de los gobiernos, ¿no? Que eran solo capacidades que estaban en manos de los militares y que ahora, sin embargo, pues están disponibles para cualquiera que los quiera o los sepa utilizar, ¿no? Y bueno, pues este espacio se ha abierto no solamente a periodistas y a periódicos, sino también a todo tipo de instituciones y de personas, entre ellas artistas y hackers que se han interesado por el mundo de la información y que están asistiendo a periódicos y a fundaciones y organizaciones para desenterrar la verdad, tanto para, bueno, pues por motivos de comunicación, pero también de derechos humanos, en tribunales, etcétera. Y bueno, pues esta tarde tenemos a 2 de esas personas que nos van a presentar 2 proyectos que han ganado premios y han asistido en la recuperación para el análisis informativo.
For information analysis, right now, I don't remember who was first. I think it was.
Vamos a tener a Dan Harvey, que entre sus muchos proyectos interesantes ha estado trabajando en un archivo que se llama el archivo sirio. El archivo sirio, ¿verdad? Sí, el archivo sirio, donde una herramienta que él ha desarrollado que se llama P-Frame ha sido usado para encontrar básicamente evidencia de crímenes de guerra en todos los archivos audiovisuales que se han ido generando alrededor de ese espacio, ¿no? Un material absolutamente infinito al que es muy difícil tener acceso sin, por ejemplo, un buen buscador. Y luego vamos a tener a Christo Buschek, que bueno, pues entre sus numerosas hazañas dentro del mundo de los hackers y del software, pues una de las últimas ha sido asistir en la investigación de la estrategia de gestión de uigures en China, por la cual el gobierno chino ha ido básicamente recogiendo y encerrando en campos de concentración, que ellos llaman campos de educación. Una vez las periodistas que estaban investigando este proyecto han sido echadas de China, ¿no? Es decir, que ha generado una herramienta para que podamos tener acceso a, bueno, pues, actividades criminales, en este caso desde un punto de vista humanitario, pero desde fuera del espacio, ¿no? Utilizando únicamente tecnología. Y sin más, bueno, pues después de las charlas vamos a sentarnos un rato para hablar de esos proyectos y le cedo la palabra a Adam. Gracias por venir.
Yeah. No, this was great. Thank you. So it's okay if we take the, yeah, okay. Thank you, Marta, and thanks, Eduardo, for the introduction. It is nice to be in Madrid, even if the weather is not spectacular, it's still better than Berlin. And I'm going to talk about my project, V-Frame, that Marta introduced. It's a computer vision project, and I'm a computer vision software developer. But I was an artist before, to some degree, depends how you think of it. And in my artwork began looking at computer vision critically in 2010. It's probably the first computer vision exploit, hacking face detection, breaking it by reverse engineering open source profiles that were used to detect faces, and then converting that into fashion design. I'm pretty sure that it made it to fairly interesting places based on conversations I've had at hacker conferences, because at the time face detection was just one algorithm, which meant if you broke the algorithm, you broke everything, and it scaled. But things have changed a lot since 2010, and we're now in the era of deep neural networks and actively trained computer vision algorithms, which means if you have enough data, you can encode almost anything into a computer vision algorithm. This opens a lot of doors, creates a lot of different problems or issues, challenges, and also opportunities. So as I've moved through in the other three examples or other computer vision projects that I've worked on, one is defeating thermal imaging, which is used in military drones to launch heat tracking projectiles, turn that also into a fashion project, and then another instance of camouflage, using it as a decoy strategy to provide sort of the perfect face and then to camouflage yourself in that. And then I began working with other artists to develop computer vision for their projects, doing things like face recognition, emotion analysis, object tracking, and by 2017, I built a custom face recognition system for Ai Weiwei's exhibition in New York at the Armory, and came out of this realizing that at this point, I'm a computer vision developer, and I could make basically whatever I wanted to, because a lot of the tools now are open source. And that got me thinking, well, as a computer vision developer, what would I make? I no longer wanted to be an artist from the outside looking in, and really changed my practice to think about, as a someone with agency of a software developer, what is it that I would want to do? Instead of continuously poking Big Brother in the eye or critiquing things from the outside, I didn't necessarily want to be on the inside. I just wanted to create what I thought was a better way of looking at the world. And the interesting thing to me about computer vision is that it encodes a certain way of looking at the world. In this example, it's encoding a cluster munition, and it forces you to look at the cluster munition in the video. This was the first demo, first example that I developed with a group called Syrian Archive, who's now grown into a larger organization called Mnemonic. And I thought, this is pretty easy in 2017. All I need is a few examples, and then I'll have a functional computer vision project. And then really hit a wall with the project, because there is just not enough data to train algorithms for very specific rare objects that appear in conflict zones. So the problem is that you need to find a rare object, but in order to find that rare object, you need a lot of that object to train an algorithm. And that meant progress was very slow, data was too scarce, and the project was borderline not tenable in the way that I imagined it. So in order to find the data, then I built a data search tool that would take millions of frames. I think it was close to, in the hundreds of millions of images, frames of videos. And it works like Google search, except you can run it offline on your own laptop or workstation. And if you want to find every example of a missile launcher, then you can probably do that interactively. The problem was still the original problem, that there just weren't enough examples of the things that I wanted to detect. And eventually found a few dozen of each object. And then the way that it works to build computer vision these days is you find examples of what it is that you want to detect, and then you put them into an annotation platform. This one is called CVAT. It's an open source tool. And then you draw boxes around everything. And when you draw boxes around it, you're encoding that thing into the algorithm once it's trained. But I still had the same problem. I don't have enough data. So it's kind of a make or break moment where either keep pushing forward or try to tackle smaller problems like deduplication or just smaller computer vision problems. And then in 2000, like for the last about 3 years, started working on this idea of, well, what if I just made the data? Instead of looking for it somewhere else, as an artist, I can create things. So what if I created the data? The fake it till you make it strategy. Starting with a few examples of what it is that I'm looking for, worked with a 3D modeler to create a 3D model of this, and then would apply a photorealistic texture to it. And you can see the model is quite realistic, but it really looks like a 3D model. It doesn't look like the images that I showed in the beginning. So there's still quite a bit of work to do in taking this very clean 3D model, and the goal is not to make photorealistic training data because it's too real. Often the images are compressed and they're copied over from one platform to another. They're taken in a conflict zone, which means that there's a lot of motion blur on the images. So they're anything but a straight, normal, clean photo coming from your camera. These are other examples of incendiary munitions, PTAB-1M, and that are delivered from cargo munitions that look like this, the RBK 500, and another object called the BLU-63. It's another cluster munition. And this is kind of where the project for synthetic data started, with a set of about 6 objects, and then used that to render these scenes that would try to mimic the way that objects were appearing in the videos that I looked at, called the target domain. And you can, in the 3D, do almost anything, spin it around, change the lighting, randomize everything. And it was working well enough in 2019 to get a good sense for the capabilities. This is the output of a cluster munition detector trained only on synthetic data. There were still a lot of challenges. If you look at the output, you can see, well, they're often damaged or covered in dirt, color changes, and some of the objects aren't detected because they're overexposed. The fins are bent, so it's a very extreme appearance of the object. Damaged munitions sometimes were missed because, as I mentioned, the fins are folded over or caked with dirt. In this example, it's too overexposed on the top, and that was missed. In this example, it was too occluded or partially buried, and that one was missed. So, looking at it from the computer vision standpoint, it's not a perfect tool because the object doesn't always appear as itself. It's mangled, damaged, could be broken into multiple pieces. And this makes it quite difficult to detect, what the question is, what is the object anymore? Because often the object changes. It's almost a dynamic object in a conflict zone. But you can see that overall it works quite well. So this was encouraging 2019-20, getting some good results. And then tried another technique, which is 3D printing the data. So would create the 3D model and put it in a SLI resin printer, and then paint that and turn it into a realistic version. If you can see here, this is a staged scene with the 3D printed munitions. So I would do all of these fairly eccentric things, like stage a scene with 3D printed objects and then move around it as if it were being documented, because I'm trying to overcome this make or break issue of not having enough data to train algorithms. And I was willing to do whatever weird art experiments were necessary to get that data. And it eventually was able to get realistic or to match the target domain enough with 3D rendering that the results really went up, and noticeably to the point where it was working even well on the damaged pieces. So here's an example of a 3D rendered AO25 RT cluster munition found in Syria. And you can see the difference in this example between, on the left, drawing the boxes on it, which is incredibly slow, monotonous, and error-prone work. It also requires that you have the data, which again is the major problem in developing custom computer vision tools for monitoring conflict zones. And just in the time you're able to draw boxes on one object, you can render 5, maybe even more frames on a simple scene. So here we can see another example of annotating and what that looks like. And for more specific numbers, in the last few years, I was only able to find about 30 videos, of which some only have 1, 2, or 3 frames. So in the end, there are about a few hundred different images. And the problem is that you need about 10,000 diverse images to train a good object detector. So there's a huge shortage between a few hundred and 10,000. And this is where the synthetic data strategy can become a real game changer. And these are more examples of what that rendering looks like. And I'll now step through the process of how each part of a scene is kind of modeled and then randomized. Because 3D tends to be too realistic, and you want to convert that to the target domain that you're working with. The first thing is to randomize the dirt and the metal qualities, the roughness and the metallic factor of it, and to randomize the color of dirt. And another thing is to kind of randomly distort it, so it's not such a rigid object, kind of looks a little bit wiggly in this video. And then to change the zoom factor, which not only changes the size, but it can also change the camera lens warp of how an object appears. And that's particularly helpful because many of the scenes are documented with smartphone cameras, which do not have a full frame CMOS sensor. So it's slightly warped because of the wide-angle 35mm style lens. Then to change and randomize the lighting conditions from a sunny day to an overcast day. Even change the color temperature of the lighting. Basically change everything you can in the scene as much as possible. No 2 images should look alike, so that the object is fully modeled in every possible way that it could appear in reality. And that also means obscuring the object and putting things in front of it, because objects are often occluded in the real world. So putting rocks in front of it, putting different types of grass in front of it. And in production, all of those factors are combined, and then you end up with a scene that looks like this. This one is pretty clean. It's for demonstration purposes, but I think you get the idea. And that would yield a large collection of images. Here's a preview. Again, these are all look the same because they have the same background. And you'd want to make sure that there's a good diversity. Now there's another problem, a lot of problems in computer vision and making something work when you don't have enough data. Because how do you test it? You can't really test it on the synthetic data because that is cheating. You need some kind of real-world data that's disjoint from the training data set. And in order to create that data set, would use the 3D printed munition, and then again stage these scenes and photograph it, trying to mimic the target domain of how objects were appearing in conflict zones by adding dirt, putting rocks around it, the occlusions. And I would use that as the benchmark data set. So I would use that to evaluate how well the object detector worked that was trained on the synthetic data. I hope you're still with me. And then here's the output of that. So this is just a pretty clean example in an early checkpoint. You can kind of see how well it works and some of the points that it breaks. And yeah, then I'll move to the latest one. So this is the second half of 2021. This is kind of the latest research and the latest development in the project is developing the detector for an RBK-250, which is a cargo munition, meaning it delivers sub-munitions, cluster munitions. And again, it starts with a similar scene, and then it randomizes the conditions for the environment and the dirt textures appearing on it. The 3D program outputs a color-coded pixel mask, and then can use that to okay, so then here's an example of it working on real footage. And this is just showing the latest version of the model. So what is important and works well with this model is that it fails when it should. For example, if only half of this RBK is visible and it looks like a barrel, it shouldn't be an RBK-250. You have to make a decision at what point is the object no longer the object, and also encode that breakage into the object detector. And this is another version, another example of it working on a very clean appearing RBK-250. You can see not only does it detect it, but the box is very accurate in the edges of it. So it really, you can tell, understands the boundaries of that object. And I'm going to move quickly through these. These are the real-world examples from an output trial on about 100,000 videos. And they are, I think, really good. The detections show that it's able to find it when the object is appearing dark, angled, partially stuck in the ground, arms appearing in front of it. You can zoom in a little bit and see that it's quite robust to the occlusions. And in another example, it also works quite well even if the object has motion blur, which is quite common for conflict zone videos because people are possibly running or moving quickly away from it. And also when there are a lot of shadows over the object, it still works really well. So this was a kind of a big moment and big breakthrough for the project, is being able to prove and run it and see it working on real data, that you can go from a 3D model to a object detector working in the real world with good accuracy. What's also important is to calibrate the model and train it in a way that it doesn't flag false positives, which are objects that look like the thing you're trying to detect. And this helps eventually reduce the time of an analyst or someone working on reviewing all of the videos that come out of it. And I have kind of a list of things that I've learned, which feels like it's quite long. I found that there is so much excitement for AI in the general sense that all of my excitement has been for a very narrow application. And I found myself really moving towards thinking about moving away from this idea of a general AI capabilities and just thinking very, very specifically about, I want an AI that can detect this very specific thing appearing in Syria, and I don't care and I don't need it to do anything else. It's very specific. And thinking about it in that way has helped stop wasting time on a lot of the other exciting areas of AI and just think practically about it, how it can be applied to the problem that, as Marta mentioned, journalists and researchers are faced with is sometimes not that the data doesn't exist for journalists, but that there's too much and you're drowning in it, and there's no way to find the needle in the haystack effectively. The other things that I learned is that synthetic data really is a game changer. And it's not just me. It's becoming much more common in many large-scale applications. In fact, Tesla is using it to kind of gap fill scenarios where they don't have enough data obtained from the self-driving cars or partially self-driving. And so they 3D model the scenes and then kind of mix that in with the real data. So the opportunities for the synthetic data in the context of conflict zone monitoring are absolutely tremendous. 3D model data is definitely the future of computer vision. And what's great is that it is also accurate, because I think you can control it. It's not like you're taking all of these images from the internet and hoping that they work. You're designing it and reviewing, and every image is intentional. It actually brings AI back to the beginning of computer vision, when engineers would do what's called feature engineering. And what the great thing about AI is that you don't have to do feature engineering, because you put a bunch of hundreds of thousands or millions of images into an algorithm, and it will automatically do that for you. The problem is that it ingests a lot of bias and problematic ways, and often noise. So with 3D data, you can really gain control over that. It doesn't always work, because there are some objects that are too generic. For example, a metal tube that has fallen off of a rocket might just be too generic to detect, unless you're willing to have a lot of false positives. It tends to work best when objects are very unique, like the RBK 250 and the AO25 RT that I showed.
El resto de objetos con los que hemos trabajado. Yo creo que ahora el gran desafío es pensar en cómo integrar las capacidades de este tipo de
research or investigations. So there definitely needs to be more development in kind of middleware or bridge software to negotiate how that data is handled. And sometimes people think maybe this is could be misguided, because shouldn't it be the researcher that makes the final decision? And that's exactly the goal of this project, is not to overtake any decision-making process. It's merely to reduce the noise and work much like many other algorithms do, to take something that's too verbose and to compress it into a manageable, smaller size. And if you can clearly define the objectives, for example, that you want to find an RBK 250 and you know what it looks like, then the rewards, I think, are huge. So as an example, I think the time is okay. Let's say you have 1,000 videos and you want to know how many contain a specific object, a cluster munition. How long would that take you on your own? You know, watching 1,000 videos from a conflict zone is not something that you really want to sit through. So can computer vision solve that puzzle? Computer vision can solve that puzzle. And the way that it works is by compressing all of those videos, by taking 1,000 videos and compressing that data set into the 1 or 2 videos, and then just put those in a folder. And then you can do your job as a journalist or as a researcher. So in more practical terms, which I'm not sure if all of you are interested in, but as the developer of the project, these are the things that excite me. So how quickly can you do 1,000 videos? On a high-end desktop workstation in probably less than 1 hour, assuming the average video length, which commonly is for documentation in conflict zones, about 1.5 minutes. That's 24 frames per second, 90 frames per video, 2,160 frames per video. Okay, I won't read all the numbers, but that works out to about 1,000 videos in 1 hour. You can do 6 minutes per 100, 1 hour per 1,000, 10 hours, about half day for 10,000 videos, and 100,000 videos in less than a week, and 1 million videos, it starts taking a long time, over a month, probably less than 2 months. Again, these are for a high-end workstation. So there is a sweet spot for the way this kind of technology works. But you could also parallelize it if you have the resources to do that, and then you don't really have any bottlenecks. But let's say that you're working offline, you want to keep your videos secure, kind of sweet spot for the way the technology works that I'm developing is if you have 10 videos, you just look at them yourself. If you have 100 videos, if you have a team, then you can probably still do it yourself. But once you get into 1,000, then you're hit with, you start drowning in the data. And that's where computer vision can really, I think, improve the capabilities of researchers and journalists. For the more developer-oriented group, the actual output that you can get is just raw text, and it tells you very simple things, which is nice. How many frames in this video contained an RBK 250? So you could think of it as a kind of visual grep, if you know this term. You can grep the video and filter it for anything that contains the object that you're looking for, and filter out everything that doesn't. But there's a lot of snake oil in AI, and that's why I don't think it's enough to merely tell you about it. There's also a demo online where you can test it, and the demo is trained only on the synthetic data, and it's completely disjoint from any real image of the RBK 250 in this example. And that's the video. At the end, you can see that you can now run these tools in your browser with some limitations, but you can process probably 50 to 100 images at a time. And then you can download or export that. And this is nice because I realize not everyone wants to manage a Python environment on their local computer to run it. So they can get structured data out that way. All of this has become a lot more urgent in the last about 2 weeks with Ukraine. And these kind of tools for monitoring online sources, OSINT, sources of data are becoming really urgently needed. And as I showed you before, one of the objects, I think, was called the RBK 500. And about a week ago, the first example of an RBK 500 was documented in Ukraine. These are, as a researcher from Bellingcat points out, extremely nasty objects that can drop hundreds of submunitions. And now that these objects are appearing, I think it would be helpful to automatically monitor for them. I mean, this not only reduces the workload, but it also prevents traumatic exposure to watching too many of these videos online. So this is one of the models that I've already created because it was appearing in Syria. And something very concerning that's happening is a lot of the scenes from Syria are now replaying in Ukraine. And I think what to many of us might have felt like very distant conflict before has become a lot closer. And so these tools to help monitor and locate and understand the conflict are also becoming more urgently needed. Thank you for listening, and also to the funding partners and research partners for the project. I just want to bring it back to the beginning with the final slide and emphasize that this is a technical project, but I mean, I'm not sure if it matters if it's an art project or an evolution or an art project in any way. But what does matter, I think, about the project is spending a lot of time with computer vision now, you realize that so much of the world is mediated through computers and software and algorithms, and that the way that we're seeing the world is through computers. And so if we can change the way that computers see the world, then I think we can begin to change the way that we see the world.
One moment. All right, that's the last slide, sorry. So, quite an audience. Thanks so much for coming, and I want to thank a lot to Matadero Media Lab and to Marta and Eduardo, and I really want to tell you, come tomorrow as well, because I think tomorrow is going to be a great session with Susan and Alberto. I think it's going to be very interesting. So, I want to talk generally a little bit, take a step back and talk about data from a high-level view and what it means as an investigative tool. All right, can you hear me? And I want to start with a little story, and the story starts in 1991 when George H. Bush, President of the United States, goes to Japan for a state visit. And during the state dinner, somewhere between the second and the third course, he starts to shake a little bit and pretty quickly vomits on the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister and collapses. The imagery that you can see invokes a lot of memories. The older generation will see the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The younger generation will think of Kevin Costner probably. But what happened back then is that these images were immediately transmitted back to the United States, and people saw the images and immediately thought, oh, the president, he died. And on CNN, the announcer on CNN was stopped mid-sentence, where he was just about
Se interrumpió una frase porque se había dicho que el presidente de Estados Unidos había muerto, y luego resultó simplemente que tenía un problema de estómago y que simplemente se le pasó y ya está. Esto es como esto es una forma de demostrar que la televisión no es todo lo que vemos, y que es la primera vez que se constató que la televisión está 24 horas 24 horas 7, o sea, todos los días constantemente emitiendo en cualquier cadena. Lo que no entendió la gente no sabía cómo lidiar con cómo podían verificar esta imagen que habían visto. Así que suficiente con esto. Creo que estamos en la misma situación cuando hablamos de datos. Los datos no son algo nuevo. Los datos hemos tenido datos durante muchos años, como ciencia política en los 70. Los científicos usan datos desde el principio del 1900, pero normalmente hablamos de datos en términos de estadísticas. Los datos, tenemos conjuntos de datos sencillos y analizan un conjunto de datos y obtienen un resultado. Creo que esto va a afectar en cuanto a la trayectoria, pero actualmente estamos en una nueva fase, estamos algo que llamamos lo que sea motivado por datos o dirigido por datos. Creo que es un nuevo paso y eso es lo que quiero hablar. ¿Cuál es la diferencia cuando hablamos de datos y algo guiado por datos y cómo afecta esto a una investigación, digamos? Otro término que también se usa mucho son métodos de computación, métodos informáticos. Hay muchas cosas incluidas en esto y que tienen una función, pero quiero resaltar el tema de guiado por datos porque es más sencillo.
The problem with data investigation is it's a relatively new field, and we have troubles defining it. For the type of work that I'm doing, there is no real job title. Like I cannot open a newspaper and look for jobs and like, oh, I'm working as XYZ and I'm looking for a job like this. So I've been called many different things, like I'm a programmer, I'm a researcher, I'm an investigator, I'm a data journalist, I'm a journalist, like I'm a lot of different things. There is not really like a category to place it in, and one of the reasons is because like we haven't defined the field yet. We're in the process of actually defining what data investigation means. And there's a lot of like different variations, like the work that Adam Harvey does is like one aspect of it. Bellingcat does other things like similar like Adam Harvey, but I think the field is much, much bigger. And I think what is important for this is like the different things have to come together, and this also makes a difference between like data and data-driven. I think like when we want to work data-driven, we need technology, we need designers, we need storytellers, and we need investigators. Like they all have to come together in order to form this new field that we call data-driven investigation. And there's like a high-level overview, and I will go into it a little bit deeper later on. But there's also like a little bit of like a process behind most of this data-driven work that we're doing. And they are not always the same, but they're roughly like you can put them on this thing. And the first one is like we have to preserve and get the data. Then we have to like explore it and find the data and see what's in there and understand the data. Then we have to verify it, because like data by itself has no statement. Data is always dependent on the context it was collected in and the data and the context in which it is observed. And then the last one is like we actually have to produce a narrative out of it, because in the end, like why we are doing all this, like why we put so much effort into it, is to tell these stories. And data allows us to tell very, very exciting stories. So my personal little bit, so that was a long introduction. So my trade, like I'm a programmer, like I programmed for like 15 years maybe now, maybe longer. And until recently I've never seen myself as a journalist or anything like this. So these are all labels that were given to me, and I am those because people call me this, I guess. But what I'm doing actually like on a day-to-day basis is like I just develop tools and methods. I sit in front of a computer, I program, I build a tool, and I give it to somebody else so they can do their work. I'm not doing the investigations myself actually, like, but I work with people who do the investigations, and I see my role as like being someone who can enable certain types of activities. Stuff that I did in the past work, like, and that's the one project I want to talk about this time. It's when we exposed the dimension of the detention of like Uyghur people in Xinjiang, and that's a project I'm going to talk about later. But in the past, like work that I did is like document the war in Syria. So I was also like my tools basically built the collection of the Syrian archive and collected like millions and millions of videos, Facebook messages, tweets, imagery, like all different kind of things. And I also, for example, like other work that I did was like to track the trade of conflict resources. That's like diamonds, gold, silver, like coming out of like Congo. We did this by like tracking like online trading databases, where we try to like follow these steps, these different databases, and see how resources leave a certain area and then arrive like in the Western world, like in London at the stock exchange and stuff like this. And also like a very old project that did is like we tried to like show the extent of like algorithmic decision making in local UK authorities. So how much do local councils and politicians rely on algorithmic decision making and like basically relinquish control of like what policy means over to algorithms without being able to influence the outcomes of this. And primarily I work with human rights defenders and journalists, but in the past I also worked with artists in academia, but that's a whole different can of worms. We can talk about it later. So this is the project I want to talk about. It's called Built to Last, and it's a series of articles that were published on BuzzFeed News. What we try to achieve here is like show the extent to which like this incarceration of the minority of Uyghur people in China in the province of Xinjiang, how big it actually is. Just a little bit background. So when we talk about Xinjiang, it's a territory in China, and it's incredibly huge. So the size of Xinjiang is 3 times the size of Spain. So I was born in Austria, it's 20 times the size of Austria. It's incredibly big, basically. It's just a pure sheer territory. It has around a population of 25 million, and of those 25 million, 45% are from like the minority of the Uyghur people. So they are not a minority in Xinjiang, they are a majority there, but they are a minority in China. The rest of the population are Han Chinese for the second biggest part, very closely following up to the Uyghur people, and then there's Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and I guess various others. So this article series was a collaboration with a journalist called Megha Rajagopalan. She works for BuzzFeed News, and Alison Killing, who is an architect, and the 3 of us worked on this series of articles. And what came out of it was 5 to 6 articles, and in these articles we combined the testimony of witnesses who actually were incarcerated in one of these detention centers and the experiences people had. And we also try to basically prove how systemic the issue is, like really to show like how big is it. Back then, when we started this research, we knew something was happening. In the West, we had roughly an idea of like around 20 of those locations. But there was a lot of speculation, like the speculation went, there's 1,000 camps. The speculation was there's only 20. Like we really didn't know, and like really goal of this was like, okay, how can we do this? How can we find out like what is actually really happening there? And the backstory for this series of articles, it's an interesting one. It started with Megha, who actually used to live in Beijing. She was the China correspondent for BuzzFeed News, and she was living in Beijing, and she heard about like the existence of these camps, and she actually drove there. She took a taxi and drove to one of these locations. That was still, I think, 2015, maybe 14. I'm not sure on the years, but it's been a while. And she took photos and she published an article about it. And what followed is that she basically lost her visa and she had to leave China, and she couldn't go back anymore and do her work there. So the problem that she faced was like, so how can you research something without being present? And this is like this classical idea of like data investigation can help you with this dilemma. How can you find a truth? How can you find something out without actually like physically witnessing it? So in 2017, Megha and Alison met like at the data investigation event, and they were discussing the situation. So how can we do this? And Alison, as an architect and with a background in geospatial analysis, of course, immediately thought like, wow, we look at satellite imagery. I mean, it's obvious, no? But so, as I said, like it's obvious, but it's not so easy because like the territory is very, very big, and to look through satellite imagery of like a territory that's 3 times the size of Spain, it will like you're busy for a few years, like at least, like I would say we haven't tried it. So this is where we started. So how can we basically start to find something out from nothing? Like this is our first step. And in computer science, you have like a thing that is called divide and conquer. So in computer science, it has a very specific meaning that includes recursion and mathematics, but like it still applies also to this situation. The idea is like you have a really, really huge problem, and how can you solve it? And the best way to solve it is make the problem smaller. And when the problem is smaller, then actually maybe you are able to solve it. And this is the whole idea. Like I think 80% of computer science works on this premise. You have one huge problem, just make it smaller so that you can actually solve it. And this is also what we try to do here. So how can we make the problems smaller? So our problem is like we have a huge territory, and if you want to look at all satellite imagery of this territory, we would be busy for years. So how can we basically say like we can do it in 1 year? Let's say that's our goal. We want to look at satellite imagery in 1 year. So we applied a little trick, and this is something that Alison figured out. She was looking on Baidu Maps, which is like a Chinese version of Google Maps. And the Chinese internet is very interesting. Here in the West, we have this idea that there's like one internet and it's one network. But actually, in reality, there's multiple internets. So there's the one in the West, and there's one internet in China. It's a very specific thing. And the interesting thing about it is they all have their own services. Like for everything that you can find in the West normally, you can also find something in the Chinese internet. And one of them is Baidu Maps, which is basically similar to Google Maps. And another aspect of this Chinese internet is that, like, on the one hand, there's always Chinese services, but the second aspect of it that is interesting is, like, it's heavily censored. Content is very strongly moderated, and, like, any service that wants to operate within the Chinese internet has to fulfill these censorship requirements that come from the state. So, as well, Baidu Maps. And so there's, like, a huge amount of censorship that is happening on the mapping material, more than in the West. And the way that they censor it, that, like, everything that is not allowed to be shown on the map, they draw a white rectangle over. This is a funny thing, like, and by looking at the implementation also, like, I was able to also see, like, how actually this censorship is implemented. And that's a very funny story. I will not talk about it now, but, like, I find it super interesting of, like, how censorship is implemented. But what this meant is that, like, can we basically check or, like, test the camps that we already knew about and see, does this censorship happen on Baidu Maps? And we did, like, a manual verification. We tried it on 6 of those locations, and on 5 of those locations this censorship took place. So everywhere where we looked on these 5 locations and where we knew there was a detention center or internment camp, Baidu Map was censoring. And this is how it looks like. So if you overlap, like, Baidu Map and now the satellite imagery, you can see basically how this looks like. So we thought, great, so how can we use this? Because, like, now we didn't solve the problem, we just moved the problem to a different area. Like, instead of, like, having to spend years looking at satellite imagery, we have to spend years looking on Baidu Maps. So that's not a solution, but it's an indicator, like, and the idea is, like, if we can automate this process and we can get, like, the 3 types of tiles that, like, Baidu Maps gives you, so it's either like a satellite tile, or there's, like, a watermark tile, that's a second type. It's a little bit, like, weird to see, but it's beige, brownish beige, or it's like a masked and it's white, and I drew, like, a black rectangle around it so that you can actually see it on the white background. But this is, like, what we got out from Baidu Maps when we looked at it, and the idea is, like, how can we, like, go through the whole territory of Xinjiang in an automated fashion and detect which of these tiles are located where, and then register the geolocation. And again, like, this is, like, the type of work that I'm doing. It's, like, a technique that is called scraping. So I think by now, like, a lot of people heard of this term, and everybody has, like, a weird definition of what it means, and there's different types of scraping, but overall you can say, like, scraping is a technique where you try to extract information from a different program, not like a location, a program, and then put it into a format that you can use again. And we have to rely, in data investigation, scraping is the alpha and the omega. Like, basically, like, this is, like, most of my time, most of my day, I deal with scraping, or I did in the past. Scraping is something that we have to do constantly because there's so much information out there, but it's all at different locations, in different formats. Very often they don't want you to have it, so if you have to circumvent your way in to get the data. And this is, like, a big part of my job. It's just, like, to scrape this data and get it from, like, one location down to my location in a format that I can use it. And that's what we did. So I wrote a computer program to actually scrape Baidu Maps in an automated fashion. And you can imagine this really like this. It's a program that opens up a browser like a human would do, goes to Baidu Maps like a human would do, and then just, like, slowly drags the map from left to right, or from right to left. again and again and again. And when it reaches the end of the province of Xinjiang, it just basically goes like one line down and just goes back again and just like slowly go through like the whole province of Xinjiang. This was, again, like it was an automated way and it was much faster than a human could do, but it was still slow because like one of the things that when you do scraping from a source where they don't want you to scrape data is like, it's like a little bit of an arms race. So they block you if they detect you, but you try to circumvent it again and again. And one technique that I apply often is like I try to pretend a human. So you have to introduce some random behavior. So you drag it 2 times to the left, then you stop a minute, then you drag it 1 time to the right, and 3 times to the left. It's like a weird game, but like you randomize this, you automate this, you just like keep it going, and you just try to make it like not too fast so they don't detect what's happening. And this program was successful. It ran for like 1.5 months on 25 servers in parallel, and that was the time that it needed to scrape this amount of data. And what we got out was like over 50 million tiles. So like the same as Google Maps, when you have like this like map, while the Earth is curved and maps are not straight actually. So there's a way that you basically straighten it up and you serve a map by like delivering like rectangles of 256 times 256 pixels, and then you just like slide them in a grid. And so each of these tiles is like, that's the atomic unit of how like these maps operate. And of these 50 millions, over 50 millions, 5 millions were still masked, censored. They had this white overlay. So that was still too much for like us to look at, right? So we still had to make the problem smaller. So a second thing, like this is just like, if you think about it, like, so what do you need if you want to operate like an internment camp? Well, you need the camp, I guess, that's the first thing. But the second thing is you also have to like deliver like food. You have like prison guards have to be able to arrive and leave again and go home. You have to bring the prisoners there. So you need infrastructure basically. So that's what we did. So on this like 5 million sensor tiles, we overlaid data that we had about infrastructure in Xinjiang. So infrastructure, that's like roads or urban areas, train tracks, like everything that basically would allow somebody to like bring stuff and get stuff away again. And with this we could like again reduce the amount of sensor tiles that might be interesting to us. And it was still a lot, it was a few 100,000, but it was better, and we thought like, well, we can start with this, let's see how far we get, and this is like now an amount that is manageable. So through this process that took like a few months, we managed like to solve the problem from we don't know how to start, down to 50 million tiles, down to a few 100,000 tiles, and we thought like now we can manage the process. So this is where we ended up. So we started with nothing, and now we started with just like a bunch of like squares to look at, mapping tiles. So the next step that we had to do is like something that we call verification. And this is, I think, the most essential aspect of data investigation, actually. And while I said like in the past, I used to do like mainly scraping, I feel like now with the jobs or the work that I'm doing, actually like I'm shifting over to like more and more into the verification area, because I think it's such an essential area. So when we talk about verification, again, the field is not defined, so there is no formal definition of what verification means in this field, but basically I would say it's like somebody's looking at data, annotates the data and makes a judgment call and puts it through a due process. Is this data valid? Can I use it? And does it tell me what I believe it tells me? Because again, as I said, like data is not neutral. Like data always has an agenda. It always comes out of like a power relationship, and it's also always like observed and like looked at in this like same power relationship. So to soften this situation, we use verification as a method to be able to deal with it. So as I said, like verification is exposing data to a due process. You can really think of it like in this like law court dramas that we watched when we were younger, of like where you have like the forensic evidence, and you really, it has to like stand scrutiny and it has to be tested. So verification can have a similar feel. But I believe that verification at the end, it's a very creative process and it's a human process. Like in the end, Machines cannot verify data for us, only humans can verify and judge actually what it is that we're looking at and placing it into a context. And I think this is a very important thing that I always want to stress out, that like it is so important to like keep the human like in charge of the whole process. It's not machines doing this stuff of work, it's like us humans doing this work. And so I think like we can augment these processes with machines, but we cannot replace humans with machines. That's like just like not a thing. And yeah, I have never seen it work, at least. And in the end, verification, what it mostly is, it's like a human-machine interface problem. When we say like, okay, I have a few 100,000 tiles, so how do you imagine what a few 100,000 tiles is? If I print out this data, I probably would fill like 3 trucks just with like pieces of A4 paper. It's an incredible amount of data to look at if you would really like, if you would turn it physical. So like, how can you manage this? And this is like the challenge, and that's why you need like these different disciplines of like, because you have to approach this problem from an aesthetic side, from like a process side, from like a technological side. And that's why like data investigation is this culmination of different fields coming together and working together. So this is how, in this case, the verification UI worked. So I'm not a designer, clearly, but it is a very functional thing, and it was driven by the needs of the researcher in this case. Whenever the researcher needed something, that's the moment when I added a functionality. So I, as a programmer, I will not decide what the researcher needs. A researcher basically has to drive the process, and I can support this process. But you can see a few things here. So in the middle, very dominant, you see like the actual map. So the map is, or you can see the location represented in 3 different types of maps. So you have Google Maps, OpenStreetMaps, and Wikimapia, which was sometimes interesting because sometimes people annotate locations of saying this is a school, or this is a mosque, or this is like a hospital. And in parallel, on the second monitor, there was like Google Earth running, which actually provided a lot of the satellite imagery. And then we had like another process where we could get like satellite imagery from a commercial provider called Planet. And then each of these locations also had a specific meaning, a category. So we place a location into a category, like we say, like, what is it that we're looking at? Like we're still in the process of looking at it. We think it's something, so we move it further in the process. We decided in the process, no, it's nothing, so we move it out of the process. And then we like, in like several iterations, we try to like get closer and closer to a judgment call about what it is that we're looking at. And this like process of like moving things through a process, this is what I call like a due process of verification. You start somewhere where you say like, I don't know what it is, it's nothing, and then like slowly you have to basically through a methodology like come to a conclusion of like what it is that you're actually looking at. So to decide if something goes into a different category or not is like what you can see at the bottom, which is like a sort of verification matrix. It's like the annotations you're making to a piece of data that give you like a confidence of that you can make a judgment call about what it is that you see. So in this case, and this is very domain specific, it depends on the research what kind of annotations you're actually really interested in. But at the bottom, you can see like what is interesting for like our domain. Like we are looking for like internment camps. So what makes up a prison camp? Do I see guard towers? Yes or no? If I can see something, then I say yes, and then like I get closer to like understanding what I see on this picture. Do I see barracks? Do I see an external complex outside? Do I see like fences, walls, like this kind of thing? And like this is something that you have to develop while you're doing the investigation to understand what it is that you're looking for. And like by like adding these kind of sources and like cross-referencing maybe with satellite imagery and stuff like this, you get closer to an idea of like what it is that you're looking at. But when you start looking at this, you don't know yet. You can assume, but that would be very bad research generally. Like that's independent if you look at data or not. So here are some examples of what this looks like from above, like because we always looked at this data with like an eagle eye. So you can see like this is the camp in Kashgar, and you can see like this is like consists of 3 different complexes. So I'm sorry. So just to repeat, like, so you can like detect or recognize like certain elements that make up a prison camp, like the fences, like the barracks, like the guard towers. This is a second example. It looks similar. It has similar markings. A lot of these barracks also have like blue roofs, but I don't think that's an indicator. And this is a third example. I think this is the detention camp in Aksu. It's a bit smaller, but like this is how like the data look like. These are like how the satellite images look like from above. So this is how we got there basically. So we started with nothing, then we ended up with like a bunch of like squares, and then we ended up with like a list of satellite images. And what we got out of it is like we could make a certain statement about like what we believe is happening in the province of Xinjiang. So we could find like 428 locations that like bear the hallmarks of prisons or detention centers. And Alison Killing, being an architect, of course, like she also measured the space that these camps take, and could like calculate that like the sheer size of this system would hold up to 1 million people, just like the sizing of like the spaces. And what we could also see is that at some point, I believe it was 2016 or 2017, a lot of these camps were built. So before that, like a lot of these detention centers were like placed in temporary locations, old schools, old factories, something that was available. But there was a moment when the policy changed and these internment camps were built. And this is like something that we could detect. The data was basically roughly put into 3 different types of categories. Like from all the data that the researcher looked at, like you can basically make 3 categories. So the one is like the stuff that we are certain. This is all satellite images of internment camps where we have a second channel of verification. Somebody who was there and could take a photo, or somebody who was like in prison and could like give a witness statement about it. The second category is like likely camps. We believe they are, but we have no second channel of verification. And the third one is like, we're unsure, but maybe somebody else can do something with it. And what for me personally is also very interesting, that on the one hand, like the output was like a series of articles, and that's like the narrative that we tell, but like the output was also data again. So we start with data and we output data again. And this data can then again be used as an input for other data research. This is what I want to show. Like, so this is a very crazy story. So there's this man. He lived in China, and he actually used our list of camps that we published, and he actually drove there and started to take footage and like try to like document actually like what it is that like hides behind these like pins on the map and the satellite images. And he made a video. It's like around 20 minutes long. It's very interesting to see. Alison also did like a long Twitter thread where she compared his video footage with the results and like really showing up like the markings of the detention centers. And this is super interesting. But what I want to show you maybe is like 5 minutes of this footage. It's in total like 20 minutes. And just to give you an idea of like how the aesthetics of these camps are, like how it looks like.
之前在 BuzzFeed News 上看过一篇报道，说是通过对比卫星地图确认了许多新疆集中营的位置，但是由于中国政府的规定，乌鲁木齐市及周边有着非常多的标记，我只去查看。这条路南侧还有多个大型的集中营区，军舰有守卫塔，并且有人值守。高科路用百度地图测量工具测得长度约1.1公里，从建筑规模来判断，这里应该关押了非常多的人。这里应该是乌鲁木齐市地区规模最大的集中营区域。这里注意建筑物顶上的标语，隐约可见"劳动改造、文化改造"4个字儿。 木骑士南边的这个红色标记实际上是西山拘留所。进入雅山公园，爬到山顶，可以很容易看到其位置所在。有一个玻璃门上贴着午间区的字样。建筑物有突出的玻璃天窗，推测被关押的人只能在建筑物里放风。条不起眼的小路，所以只能爬上山头拍摄，还不敢站立拍摄，怕被人注意到。军营门口还摆了2辆坦克，远看还以为是天安门撵人的那一款，其实不是。这一片区域不止一个军营，周围的建筑可能是营房或者别的附属设施。可以看到院内停了很多军用卡车，应该驻扎了不少党卫军在这里。在这些军营的背后，更远的地方可以看到有围墙、铁丝网、守卫塔，那里就是集中营位置所在了。本想离得近一点，可是没有。
Okay, so I want to come back to like my previous question, what is data-driven investigation really? And I before said like data-driven investigation is defined through doing data investigation. And so I can only answer the question from my point of view as a programmer. I'm not an investigator, I'm not a storyteller, I'm not a designer, but like I build tools for data investigation and I collaborate with people that do this kind of work. I think it's super, super important. It's really, I cannot like state it often enough that it's really important that like different disciplines come together. Like I, as a programmer alone, I cannot do data-driven investigation. I can only do it together with designers, with investigators, with people who look at the aesthetic, at the meaning, at the context of things. And because I'm also working a lot with journalists and like lately I'm speaking more to journalists than I ever did before, but like one thing is also very important for journalists to understand is like practitioners of data investigation are mostly not found in newsrooms. There's a lot of people who do this kind of work who are like interested and are great partners and collaborators, but they are not working in a newsroom because there is no education for data investigator. There is no job title. Like it's very hard to have like a very rigid or old structure and like expect that these people come out of this structure. It's like these people come out of new structures that don't exist, but like they're very happy to work with journalists in this case. And I think it's also very important to understand that like if you do data investigation, everybody who collaborates here has to be an equal person. One thing you should not do is like outsource your core competencies. Don't think of like the person who writes your software as being like the IT guy that like, I don't know, sits in a corner and you don't talk to this person. Like you have to involve everybody who's involved in this project like on an equal basis because like it's the expertise that you're looking for. It's like the insight and the creativity that these different fields can bring together. It's also like in terms of journalism, it's interesting that like that this is also getting more and more recognized, of course. Programmers don't tend to win journalistic awards. That's not a thing that happened, but it starts to happen now. And that's also something that journalists do have to realize that like if you do want to continue doing this work, that like it does help to involve these different people into your journalistic work, and that it's not like an either-or situation, but it's really like a situation where you have to work together. And maybe also just like to sum it up again, like in this research we started from like not knowing anything, then we knew something, and we could use it as a stepping stone to then know more. And that's also something that you do often in data-driven investigation. You start with at one place and you use it as a way to bootstrap your way to a different place. And that's like a very important difference also when I say like there was data and there's data-driven. And I think this is like an attribute of like data-driven investigation, that you can use data then again to then like elevate yourself to a different place and a different sphere of like information and knowledge. Why I think that data-driven investigation is very interesting also for journalists is that like often I feel like journalists are working very much with like witness statements, with anecdotes, like they hear a story from a person and those anecdotes are super important. These witness statements are actually like they set the framing and they make us understand what it means, what we are talking about. So they are very, very important. But I think like to add to this, like if we can then also like show how systemic something is, that's like then you really hit it. Like then you can really like prove on the one hand like the dimension of something that is happening, and you can also show like why it matters and why it's a terrible thing that we're talking about. And it's a combination of both things that I think like data-driven investigation allows us, and I think that's a very interesting aspect. So as a last thing, I think I'm over time a little bit, I'm not sure actually, but because I'm a software developer and I build tools, like I built tools for many, many years. So I want to just like give like I don't know, like a parting insight from my last years. You can take it or not, I don't care. But basically I make a distinction between two types of tool. Like when I build something for data investigation, there's like two things that I'm talking about. So one is like something that I call a general purpose tools, and they are gold. Like if we have a general purpose tool, they're like incredibly valuable. Like these are tools that we can like use again and again for different projects. So we have to learn them once and then we can use them again. And those are tools that we can like repurpose for different use cases depending on like what it is that we want to do. There's only very few tools that are available that do this, but they're very, very useful and we should learn them well. But as a tool builder, those are the hardest tools to build. Like it's very rare that you build a tool that is actually really general purpose. And if you actually want to do this, then suddenly your problem space of like building a tool changes rapidly, because then suddenly becomes a problem of maintenance, of a problem of generality, a problem of making it work in every situation for every person, for every use case. And that's a very, very hard problem and very resource intensive. You have to put a lot of money into it in order to make this happen. And the second type of tools that I think is actually like the type of tools that we're going to build most of the time, it's something that I call ephemeral tools. They're just like temporary tools. They're tools that like we make them, they have a purpose, we use them for this purpose, they fulfill the purpose, and we throw them away. Like all the work that went into it, we just throw them away, we don't care about it anymore. And when we need something similar again, we build them again from scratch. And the reason why we do this is because like it is much easier and less resource intensive to build these kind of ephemeral tools. And in data investigation, like resources are a problem, they're scarce. And technology is not something, a problem where you just throw money at it either. Like even if you have a lot of money, like we tend, like it's not so easy to actually make it work. And I think like as a strategy in a resource constrained environment, like thinking in ephemeral tools has a high level of, like a high potential of success. If you think in general tools, like you're gonna have like a really, really big project at your hand. And of course, sometimes that's what you want, and that's fine, and that's great if you can do it. But I think like very, very often, most of the tools that we use, we really have to think of them as one-time tools. If you're, I don't know if anybody ever did carpentry, but like I once built a staircase out of wood. And before we actually started building the staircase and cutting like planks and like beams and everything, we actually built little wedges and molds that we used in order to cut the wood. And we did this because then we created a tool in order to use our other tools on it. And then once we cut all the wood and we used these wedges or these molds, we threw them away. They were useless. You cannot reuse them anymore because they were just built for one single purpose, and that's what we use them for. And there's no maintenance involved, and we can just like do it and be done with it. And I think that's a very, very good thing. So for this research, we have like general purpose tools that we use. This Excel. It's like really good for a lot of things, not just budgets. I use it a lot like to actually look at data. It's very useful. And of course, Google Earth is like a fantastic tool if you're like into satellite imagery. But then of course, the ephemeral tools that we used for this research are like the scraper to get the data and this verification UI. And this verification UI is something that I keep on building. Like there is no general solution to this problem because like every research requires a different type of verification and outcome, and therefore like I tend to start again and again and rebuild like every verification UI for every project and not like reuse the same thing or not even try to make one UI that tries to rule them all. I don't think there's a lot of like success in this. So thank you a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Come with me. No, I'll be here. No, because then I have to be ping-ponging between you two. Hi. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your super interesting talks. I was wondering, I wanted to ask you both the same thing. Have you been, I mean, you just won a Pulitzer, so congratulations for that. You've been working on detecting war crimes evidence for quite a few years, and we are now in the middle of what some people call the first, like, you know, big cyber world war, where a lot of important material is coming out every day, and also most countries are defining their ability to charge Russia with war crimes in real time. So you both make tools that would be useful for that. Have you been called by any newspaper? Oh yeah, sure. ¿Podemos tener otro micro?
Not by a newspaper yet, but I've certainly started working on this right up until the moment I caught my flight here to develop the tools a little more specifically for the munitions that are appearing in Ukraine. The important thing to know is not all of them are useful. It's, for example, not useful to know that someone has an AK-47 because everyone has an AK-47. It doesn't tell you anything new. And the reason that I'm detecting these very specific munitions is because I've been told by the researchers, human rights researchers working with mnemonic, that these are very, like important from a legal perspective if you can prove that they were used, because these munitions, it becomes a little more complex, but violate the Convention on Cluster Munitions. However, the US nor Russia none of them are signatories of it. So whether it actually can go to the International Criminal Court and lead to a war crime charge against Putin is not clear. But it shouldn't stop anyone from gathering enough evidence and trying to put together a case. And each image that's found is one more addition to that legal case, one more page in that stack of legal documents that proves the wrongdoing. So it's very important to find every single one. And in doing so, you create an overwhelming picture of wrongdoing, of violation of human rights, or of a war crime. So not exactly directly with newspapers, but things are quite entangled in that when it becomes more of a story, then it's important to connect with a newspaper about it. And I think at this stage, for me at least, I guess there's probably a difference. I don't want to set us apart, but I'm not looking for a story in my work, or I'm not working directly on that angle. I mean, I would like to, but I'm really approaching it as a technologist and trying to develop a tool that is complex and that can be used in a simple way to compress complexity and abundance in data into a manageable, useful amount and insight that leads to an action. And then it's often the group I work with, who coincidentally Christo worked with, and I'm kind of dealing with, Christo collected so much data when he worked with this group that I'm now faced with this task of sorting through all of that, which is a problem that extends to, it just like generally extends to the internet in the way that so many videos are published online, and you can't keep up with it. And you really do need better tools to manage and filter all of that information, to put it into the, onto the desk of journalists or human rights researchers or lawyers. And there's a huge growing community of people, especially now that the conflict has come much closer, the war in Ukraine, and it's a lot more urgent and a lot more people are involved, and it's become, in my perspective, less of a uncertain area. This is certainly not everyone wants to deal with conflict zones. It can be, quite psychologically difficult if you look at a lot of it. But now it's in your face every day, and you can't really get away from it. So in a way, it's normalized the practice of looking through it in order to collect insights and to help other people and to form a community of researchers in order to build a story or a legal case from that.
Of course. I mean, I don't know if I'm right thinking this, or I might be wishful thinking, but would it be possible, and I'm thinking as a journalist, of course, because it's all that I am, would it be possible for a TV station that has people on the spot recording and receiving a lot of audiovisual material from the war zones, maybe from collaborators or even people from different platforms, etc., to be detecting a given, I don't know, cluster munition or any of the elements that constitute war crimes because, they're technologies for weapons that are not meant to be used against humans anymore or ever. And would it be a technology that could be detecting in real time all this material for journalistic purposes, because it would resolve puzzles that take a long time to resolve for just, simple humans, apart from what you just mentioned of exposing them to really nasty material in the first place. But also we're dealing with a war, as with any war, I guess, where time is a factor that we can measure in lives. So as soon as we can establish that war crimes against humanity are being committed, the less people will die, technically, I mean, hopefully. So why aren't all the people that are making these materials using a tool like yours? That's what I wonder. Why is not your tool in every newspaper?
Because it just finished.
Oh,
it's new.
okay.
I
was assuming it was our fault.
No, and I think the challenge is in figuring out what to do once this technology exists, and how do you bridge it with a group of journalists, because you can get the output and you can format it in various ways as different types of structured data, but what do you do with that? So you still need, like Christo mentioned, a verification system that provides a UI to interface with the data of, for example, a computer vision system. because the V-frame can process a lot, but you still need to monitor that in some way. And I think the urgently needed tool, something that I'm working on, is how do you bring in as much data as you can in real time and provide the useful output in real time, and what does that look like? And there are actually only a few really important munitions that fit the profile of what computer vision can do and are unique enough that they'll have a high hit rate and a low false positive. And those are the ones that urgently need to be 3D modeled and built into training data sets and then turned into this model. And the models, as I mentioned, this model zoo, which is the sort of jargon for like a collection of different specific models that you can deploy. And the actual processing is a general tool. You take videos in, then you do something to it. But you need a certain model. And it could be looking at general things. It could be looking for, I don't know, a cat, right? The worst example to give, but also the most common example in many generic detectors is all of these quite generic objects from the internet that have almost zero relevance to journalistic work. And there's such a huge distance between all of the commercial imagery online and the types of things that you want to detect for real research projects. And that's kind of the game-changing quality of synthetic data, is that you can introduce a training data set for anything you want. So, and it can also be spun up fairly quickly. So I think the new models for specific to Ukraine, which would be cluster munitions, sub-munitions from this RBK 500, will be ready in a matter of weeks. And then, it's a matter of interfacing it with some kind of UI verification tool, and then, so we'll just go in this order right here, actually.
That would be nice.
But maybe to come back to your previous question about so the Ukraine conflict is very interesting because never before was data analyzed and verified in real time. Ukraine is really unique, it's the first time. So Syria was the first real big conflict where this kind of permanent documentation took place, but the ingestion of this data was always delayed by some time, people were not that quick. Ukraine seems to be the thing, I'm amazed at how fast people are going through the imagery, the videos, the tweets and stuff like this. So there is a machinery already running that is trained, that knows how to deal it. People have experiences and they apply it now in Ukraine and very successfully. But I think we should also consider that when we talk about human rights violations, of course, speed is not everything. And most work in human rights, especially when we talk about court cases, they're very slow and they always happen afterwards. Realistically speaking, I think the work is very, very important. But if we find a tweet and we can detect this is this type of ammunition, it didn't stop this ammunition from dropping. And also, if there's anything to be learned from Syria, it will also not stop the ammunition from dropping again. So it is very interesting to have this kind of analysis, and it's very, very important. But I think that big part of this job, or a part of this job, is actually a slow-moving job. And I think both are very relevant things. So I think this real-time analysis is super interesting because we need to know and we want to know. But there's also then a second step that basically goes at it and looks at it in a much, much slower pace with a very different goal and purpose.
I see. So now that it's been 3 weeks since the invasion started, and knowing the different projects that you have been involved in and that you have developed for, what opportunities do you see in the different materials that are coming out? Do you ever think about, you see the, I don't know, footage or information that comes through the internet and think, oh, I could do something with that? Have you been, has something popped out? Is there any particular source that you find particularly interesting? Me, for instance, I'm obsessed with planet.com and all the satellite imagery and how it can become a map of, a trace map of all the destruction that is being, deployed over the days just by comparing one day to the next. Have you, what what comes to mind? What would be your points of entry in this conflict?
So maybe one thing, like, I mean, dealing with huge amounts of data, as we did in Syria and as we do now with Ukraine, it poses a lot of challenges. Like, so the Syrian archive definitely faced the challenge of, like, we have so much data, we don't know what to do, and like tools like Adam Harvey would then come in and have the promise, or we can help with the complexity of the amount of data. But I think very often also, like, what is interesting to consider is that, like, while it's good to have all this data, sometimes we don't need all the data in order to make a case. So if you want to talk about, like, a specific event that happened, if I have 10 videos showing that one event, then maybe I can stop. Maybe I don't need 11th video, or I need a 12th video, right? But these 10 videos that you want to have, they have to be, like, good quality, and they have to, like, really, like, document what happened and show, like, really, like, give you this narrative story, like, just gives you, like, the complete picture, so that, like, that there is no doubt anymore. So I think, like, what will be interesting in Ukraine is that, of course, like, we thought Syria was producing a lot of data, and Ukraine is now just like it's again like a different, like, level in that regard. And I think what will come out is that, like, there's more data, but it also means there will be more high quality data. If I, like, be, like, very technical now, like, of course, like, the things that we see are very horrible, but I think it will, on the long term, just help us, like, to have, like, stronger cases to show what actually happened, and, like, try not to leave any doubt about it.
I just wanted to circle back to one thing you said in the earlier question, which is around, is there a way to coordinate with people to get them to document more? And there are a lot of similarities, but some differences between Syria and Ukraine. And one is that internet has been shut down in certain regions. And so there won't be any documentation for a while, but there could be a burst of documentation. And there could be also, if people realize that there are a lot of OSINT or human rights researchers and journalists looking at the material, they may be incentivized to create more. But there's also a risk that needs to be communicated to people on the ground that documenting submunitions is risky. And unless you know specifically which ones they are, you have a high risk of a dangerous encounter or exploding it, because some of them can be triggered electromagnetically or by proximity sensors. So unless you know specifically that it is a 9N235 submunition, then you should really not get much closer to it unless you have certainty. So this is something that I didn't realize until later on in discussing with more people about, it would be good to collect more evidence. It's also more training data, and the more data that the other side has, they have a bigger window and more perspectives into what's going on. But there's also a risk that needs to be communicated with people in conflict zones, so they don't put themselves in harm's way when they're documenting things for researchers who are sitting safely in another region.
Just a small thing to add also, like, I mean, we always, and especially programmers, like, they always think in the happy path. Like, we always try to think of the scenario that makes us all happy. And the happy path in this case is, like, we get, like, a lot of, like, high quality, good documentation, so that we can understand what is happening, and that also, like, later on some sort of justice can be maybe approached eventually. But of course, like, this huge amount of data also means, like, the amount of data that is, like, fake or is, like, easy to misinterpret it will also, like, increase. So, like, not only do we get more data that we have to, like, digest and look at, but also the amount of data that we have to, like, discard because it's obviously, like, not right data, like, will also increase. And that's a problem. That's, like, the unhappy path. Like, this is something that, of course, we also have to deal with in this case. And I think it already happened in Syria, from what I remember, and of course, like, in this conflict with Russia being, like, having a very different, like, infrastructure, this will just intensify, and it has to be seen what's going to happen. And I think there has been, like, at least one right in the first day or second day, like a missile attack on, like, on a residential building in Kiev. And I think people were immediately quickly saying this was, like, a Russian bombardment, and some people were like, no, wait a minute, this looks a little bit fishy. It could be actually, like, a very, very different story behind it. And I think, like, of course, the problem with, like, this, like, real-time interpretation, you make a lot of mistake, and that's fine. Like, if you do something quick, it's okay to make a mistake, but like you have to be able to then get back to it later on and look at it like with like a perspective and distance and see like was I right or was I not right, like, and I think that's an important aspect then.
Yeah, when it comes to verification, I was wondering what sources would be clean from origin, no? And I was wondering if the kind of materials that you are searching on VFrame would be, for instance, visible from a satellite, because I mean, like military-grade satellites have a degree of precision, and on the ground, I wonder if it would be that precise.
I don't know exactly how precise these satellites can be. I think it's quite hard to get access to that resolution. But what we know is the resolution is going to keep increasing, and that in the future, there's going to be better access to higher quality satellite information from private companies, probably, and also from, you could imagine a kind of quadcopter drone flying into a conflict zone and doing a survey of the area and then bringing that back for analysis later. This is something that's already happening to some extent. So, I mean, what's interesting, you know, from the synthetic data perspective, again, is that you can remodel it to work, excuse me, from an aerial perspective. So everything has to be, you have to encode the way that people are looking at the object. And in most cases, that's with a smartphone, and you figure the average human height, and sometimes bending down to get a close-up. That all needs to be encoded in order to get a good performance model, the way that people are observing it. So that switches, and it becomes actually a little bit cleaner. Satellites are very calibrated. It's always the same sensor that's collecting it, and it's very calibrated. Whereas you have so many different kinds of smartphones that are collecting it, and it's compressed when it goes to a social media platform. So there's no calibration. There's no chance for getting that high quality. Yeah, the satellite imagery.
Yeah, exactly. They would be clean in terms of sensor, and then would be clean in terms of verification.
Right, so when that resolution increases, there are going to be a lot more opportunities. Already so many different computer vision technologies are working on satellite imagery, and I think it's not something actually I've looked at too much yet, but I've done enough prototyping with quadcopter type footage that you can, it's pretty absurd how accurately you can detect a person who is about the size of an ant from a quadcopter footage with really good accuracy. And the number of computer vision libraries to detect using high resolution imagery, 4K imagery from a quadcopter is also increasing. So these two developments are coming to a head that points towards really strong capabilities for aerial surveillance, which from the perspective of conflict zone monitoring is good, but there's also the flip side of that, which is very pervasive, ubiquitous surveillance for any purpose.
I'm tempted to open for questions. I don't know how are we doing time-wise, but what are your favorite sources of data? Like the ones that are, I don't know if cleaner, but maybe the richer sources of data for this kind of investigation?
I mean, obviously satellite imagery is extremely powerful. Like there's a lot to be gained from satellite imagery, and I think we're only starting to see, I think it's the beginning there, because like the commercial satellites are getting like better and better, and the precision gets higher and higher, and I think we can use this more and more. And also like this imagery is more available. Like in the 90s, like we had no access to satellite imagery, but then a policy change, and like the US decided satellite imagery has to be a private sector, and that's why we have access to this now. So their reason was like, so they can present satellite imagery without revealing the military capability they have. So that was the reason why we have a private sector of satellite imagery, and I think that's super interesting. I think social media, as annoying as it is, I think it's still like a very important source, but it's also the source that is very, very messy. Like you produce a huge amount of data, and you don't know what you're gonna get. And I think like most of social media is probably like not to be trusted. But but still it is a very good source because it is what people experience directly. Like it is like one of these very, very important sources. But I think sometimes it's also really just like newspaper articles. So like another project that I did is like we were scraping media articles in order to get certain types of information. And in order to get to these media articles, we use Google search. Plain simple, something that you can do manually. And then of course you can just like do it massively as well if you use a machine for it. Like, so I think there's like a lot of sources of data that we can think of. And the good thing about data investigation is like it gives us the methods and the methodologies to combine this data. And I think that's also like maybe something to keep in mind. Don't use one source of data, use multiple sources of data and see what sticks.
Do you have any?
Social media is the obvious go-to for collecting free, cheap, sometimes good quality, sometimes low quality data. I think the next, what's next in line is to form partnerships and collaborations with people who have access to the conflict zone safely, and to do survey captures and to work more directly with the people in those locations to obtain the data, do it in a safe way also, and to not become too reliant and addicted to social media as the provider of a ground truth, because it's not reliable. It can be, but it's not a reliable, stable source of that data. So I think it's also very comfortable to sit back and collect data that way. And I think there needs to be some work done in forming new partnerships with very brave people, humanitarian groups that go into harm's way, and to help show them how some surveying tools can help collect data and even present a ground truth of that location, and that can be further analyzed using both manual and automatic tools.
Maybe, because I totally agree. Like social media is very unreliable and we have to be very careful with it. And I think like one approach that some civil society organizations are taking is to create like custom applications, mobile applications that they give to people. And these applications have a different way of collecting the data that they're interested in, that are like more vetted or like have certain safeguards included. And like there has been a few attempts in the past to build these kind of applications, and I would say the success rate was like so-so. But I do see like these projects are they come up again and again, because it is like one way that people think it could work. If you have like collection tools that are like more purposeful or more like focused on the task, that maybe this would like increase the quality of the data.
Another big problem is the admissibility of data. In a legal situation, so it's hard to prove whether an image on social media is real or not. And then sometimes you need, I've heard, a photo of someone taking the photo in order to verify that the photo is real, which is an absurd requirement, especially in a conflict zone, even in reality. And these apps are, I think, if they can be communicated and if people are comfortable and if they have a good design and user experience to make it easy enough and not a burden to collect data in that way, then that does provide a kind of certified provenance of the documentation. So that overcomes the problems and limitations of social media as a legally admissible form of documentation.
I think when we talk about social media, like we started from a place where we said like everybody is an authority, right? Every data is to be trusted, and that's okay. And I think like especially when we talk about legal requirements, like legal entities, they like authority. Like that's why you have like specialists who are called into court and testify, and they're specialists in an area. And if they say something, then it's admissible in court, it's like acceptable in courts, and it's an authority. And I think what we're also going to see is like a pickup of like certain structures It can be either organization, for example, the OPCW is an organization that is like an authority on chemical attacks. I think we're going to see more authorities that basically provide data for these kind of cases and are being like fed through like these unreliable sources and have a process to basically digest this and make this like a source of truth in the end.
Well, isn't this more or less what forensic architecture is doing? Collecting all this different information, these layers of information, or as they say, pinning all these layers of different information, a lot of them coming from social media, into a space or a building or a scenario of war crimes, and then creating this narrative around all this material for justice purposes. I mean, I don't know if that. I mean, I am conflicted in how this method is entirely, like in its format, useful for journalistic purposes, even though they're already collaborating with the New York Times and with the Washington Post and stuff, and there is like a clear aesthetic that is being now replicated in the media that is a very distinct forensic architecture aesthetic. But I wonder what the difference it is in terms of the journalistic approach. And also it bothers me that when we're using tools for analyzing and filtering this kind of materials, there is a fiction of objectivity or cleanliness. I mean, you've been working on the ideas around AI and how they play games with us in this context. So do you see, you are both artists working on this topic for a long time. Do you see ways where the credibility of your tools results could be dangerous in that regard? I don't know if I've explained myself. That was a bit of a meandering question.
I would say, like, I speak for myself. I think the tools that I'm building, like, what comes out of it, there's always a danger that suddenly, like, it's not valid anymore. I think this is just like how it is. I think maybe what would help is like if we focus more on methods and less on tools. I think like ideally the tools follow the methods, and we define the methods first, and we have like a way of verifying that the methodology itself is solid, or like solid within the framing that we have, because that's also like a thing. Like if I publish an article, I don't know, like in Austrian online newspaper, I have a different framing than when I go to the ICC and I accuse somebody of genocide. That's a very different framing, and you have to apply very different like methods in order to come to a conclusion. And so, but I think like if you start with the methods, and this, I think, is just like how research probably has been done before, like that, like focus on the methodology and then build the tools to support your methodology. I think that's maybe like a way to deal with this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I got from both your talks was that you are very keen on focusing on the problem before the solution. It's just like this. Let's say that the big tech companies' approach is always to build a tool that absorbs as much data as possible, and then it's always a tool in search of a problem, no? Like tools looking for a problem to resolve, and then the solution always ends up having the shape of the tool, no? Like the tool defines the problem and the solution. And in your case, I see that you're both working from the problem perspective, like you're creating solutions for specific problems. I guess the danger for that is creating only ephemeral tools, the way you described at the end of your talk, that your tools will always be serving that one purpose. But it would seem to me that that all your tools are useful for that one purpose with very different objectives, no? And very different contexts, like the protocol that you developed using maps, or the searching, like you're kind of, I kind of call it like clear view for nasty weapons tool. So what are the new, what new purposes do you imagine those tools that you have built would have in the next few months or maybe few years? Do you see life after, after that particular context?
I'm a pessimist, so I don't know. But like, I would say like I think it's a natural thing as a program, and I can speak for myself, of course, and I guess it will be similar for you, but like programmers, they like to solve problems. Like they always look at something and they see a problem that can be solved. It's like, it's a natural thing, like that you don't look at really like the problem, but you just look immediately at the solution. And I think like one thing that helped me personally to overcome this gut reaction is like to overthink of like the trade-offs first. I think like when we think about like digital tools, like people tend to overthink like, what do I win with it? What can I do suddenly, right? But actually every tool that you build, you also codify a trade-off. You lose something with everything that you do. And this is like more true with digital tools than with anything else. And I think like it's very good to think about like, what do we win? I think that's a very important question, but I think we always have to at the same time ask the question, what do we lose when we do it this way and when we have this tool? And is the price worth it? And I think that's a very, very important question. I think if we start asking this question as well, then we take a step back from like just looking at the solutions and also actually consider the problem, because then we have to balance the problem and we have to like think about like what it is that we want that comes out of it at the end.
I'm going to open the conversation to our audience. Is there any question? Okay. Do we have? Yes, we do.
Well, hello. Yes, I would like to know about the legal barriers, because, for example, Christo had a very clear example in China with their legal barrier, which was those spaces being censored on the internet. So I wanted to know if you will have this similar problem here in our freer internet, which will be like, for example, in the privacy legislation, which will make like more difficult to access those data. So we see in China clearly the example, but maybe we have the same issues here, but in a different way.
I think like when we scrape, like one thing that we, like scraping is always a gray zone, like legally, like, and to be honest, and luckily I'm not a lawyer, because maybe I would have to stop doing it otherwise. The one problem that I saw with a lot of data is that like copyright is an issue for us. Specifically with the Syrian archive, I know that like a lot of data that the Syrian archive collected was taken down from the platforms because of copyright violations. And then suddenly like this data disappeared. So we did actually like track this, and I had a method to actually detect how much of the data disappears. And it was like on YouTube, I think like between 12 and 20% of the data, depending on the platform. And very often this data was not taken away for a specific reason, but just because like a algorithm, a computer process just said like, I remove it now. And Google has this approach of like, remove it first and then see if anybody complains. And most of the time people don't complain, and then it just stays like this. And then specifically with this case, like because we could track this and we could complain, they actually restored a lot of it again. But like the reason why it was taken down initially was like copyright violations. And this was mostly because like somewhere in the background, a song was playing, for example, that had a copyright and was like not licensed or whatever. Like, but scraping like data, like getting the data, like not everything that follows, but like getting the data sometimes has issues where we scratch like the questions of like what is legal and what is not. And there have been also situations where I said like I will not do this because like for legal reasons or ethical reasons. So there's a legal component, and of course there's an ethical component as well. Like yeah.
Any other question?
Hi, thank you. Do you have any specific tools to skim the, for example, social media in order to gather data, not just for sources, but more for training an algorithm for detecting this kind of objects?
For pulling the data, for scraping? That's kind of Christo's department.
An archive, that's kind of like what we did. So the tools that were in use there, that like I developed there, were basically meant to like scrape data from like, I think in the end it was 10 or 11 different sources. So this was like from YouTube to Twitter to Facebook, like all different kind of things. So this tool existed, like many people like build these tools, and like a lot of those platforms, for example, like Twitter, it's actually quite easy to get the data because they do provide you access that where you can have legal access to the data. You just don't have access to historical data. So I think there's a lot of tools in different varieties, from graphical interfaces to browser plugins to like command line tools. I think there's also like, if we think about tools, it also helps to think through like the whole process of what it is you want to do with the data. Because for example, just getting the tweet, very often it's not enough. You also have to like move the tweet into a different process, because like, of course you can save it on a screenshot or like the text on your hard disk, but then what do you do with it afterwards? So I think like if you want to choose any tools for a research, like think about like the whole process, the whole pipeline of data that you want to build, and where data comes from, where it has to go through, and where it has to end up in order for you to be useful. And I think like then these different tools can align and it makes more sense, and then you can make a judgment call about like what kind of tool to choose and which not.
And I'll just add, in knowing that there are people and programs working on this challenge and this problem, I decided to decouple the work that I'm doing from the data collection part of the process and focus specifically on the data analysis in a very specific kind of visual. There's also, as I mentioned, there are so many different AI fancy, shiny objects to look at and algorithms. It's quite easy to get distracted because there's the possibility of doing audio analysis on the cluster munitions going off, and actually Microsoft work on a project about that. And you can also look at the more temporal qualities of to do like, you know, over multiple frames analysis. And I just decided to try and, I guess, divide and conquer and focus on one thing and try to do that really well. And I wanted to also counter a little bit something you said, or it's often perceived in used pejoratively, the having a solution in search of a problem. I think it's really important for some of these tools to be ready to go, because when a conflict emerges, it sometimes takes a really long time before people learn about everything that's happening. And this is something that I've been working towards, is to expand these collections of models called the Model Zoo in order to make it more applicable to if a future scenario were to erupt. So I've been talking with a lot of international organizations about which regions they see potential for conflict, and then thinking about which munitions are already used there, who are the weapon suppliers, and what are the likely scenarios that could emerge, and then having a solution ready for the problem.
Well, actually those weapons are built, designed, painted by people, by companies, no? Do you think there would be a possibility of those companies releasing deliberately sufficient data around these weapons for you to use in VFrame?
I think they have less than zero interest in...
Yeah, I mean, of course, but what if it was like a legal request?
Yeah, I have looked at a lot of catalogs for the weapons companies, and they just don't seem to be overlapping much with the human rights groups and researchers that are trying to undo a lot of what the mess that they've created. So the people that are interesting to work with are just a lot of the international aid organizations, and I've tried to meet and work with people in just a little more diverse groups. So I presented this project in Geneva last November to the Mine Action Technology Workshop, and it was, I guess they hadn't quite seen something like this, and it's not the most exciting place to work in, although I find it pretty exciting the first time I went there, the kinds of technologies that are being used. It's pretty serious business, and you get a lot of long-term companies because there's a lot of reputational challenges in working in this field. So it's not often that a newcomer drops by for a coffee at the Mine Action Technology Workshop. But I think this is exactly what I was referring to before. It might be quite uncomfortable in the beginning, but I think these are the opportunities that are really worth pursuing, is stepping away from the computer and out of your comfortable office chair and just going and do things that might not work out and then seeing where they lead to. So that's I mean, where I'm trying to head with the V-Frame project is to really need to meet people and make relationships and then, you know, move towards the real reality, not just the social media reality, and see if you can even, you know, plan ahead and start preparing things in advance rather than like a just-in-time solution or not quite in time solution.
Test? Hi, my question has to do with the synthetic training data and the 3D modeling that you were using. You didn't get into how you avoid bias in that training data, because I assume you're drawing on existing videos and pictures and images of what, you know, a half-exploded bomb is looking like. How do you avoid the fact that you only have the ones you've detected, and there may be undetected bombs out there that you should be looking for in the future, right? I mean, how do you deal with that kind of inherent bias in your available, the model for your synthetic training data, I guess?
That is something that I've thought about. That's you really skipped ahead with that question, because you can only know as far as what you've seen so far. This is why it's really important to look at all the videos that you can to understand the context. And there are many variables to that context. I've realized everything from the, you know, how much motion blur, what quality of cameras, what's the megapixel resolution, the type of lens, is it zoomed in, is it overhead, are people using DSLRs? I had the problem where I received photos from a DSLR, so like a prosumer professional level camera. There was so much texture in it that it didn't work, because I had trained it for quite low resolution and introduced a lot of compression. And then this image had just, you know, very fine texture that it didn't work on that, which was strange. So I had to degrade it in order to make it work with the algorithms that I had developed. So that's another, you know, example of, you just wouldn't expect a really high quality photo after looking at all of these quite low resolution. And I had totally not considered that data input. And it is unrealistic, because it was not one of the typical photos. It was from, you know, it was on request kind of photo. So in that way, it didn't transgress the ideas of what it should look like. But yeah, you can only see as far as the data. So you have to then imagine other scenarios and try to plan in advance for what those could be. That's basically as far as you can go with it.
Susan? I think the porn industry has the same problem. Too much resolution kills the game.
Great. Thank you for two fantastic talks. And I would have lots of questions for both of you. Maybe just to continue the synthetic data, which I find really interesting, because, I mean, I'm someone who spent a lot of my career within the sphere of the law. And the horizon of some sort of legal accountability, I actually think is quite flawed, in fact, and the idea that one would gather evidence for this tribunal that may one day come. I think we have to act much more decisively in the present, and not this sort of legal horizon that we might actually produce some sort of evidential archive for. But that being said, Adam, I was curious about, like, I live in the UK, where there's only one form of automated image capture that's actually legally admissible, which is the speed cameras that capture images of people speeding in their cars. It's the only image that has any legal status that can never be challenged. Doesn't need to be corroborated. So satellite imagery, there's no agreed upon set of legal guidelines such that they could operate as standalone evidence. They always need to be correlated. And I guess I'm wondering, from your experience, like at least my experience tells me that the judiciary is so hopelessly behind at the level of understanding technological innovation. I really wonder how the prospect of synthetic data, it certainly would already, AI already radically challenges the legal kind of like understandings. How, as a practitioner, do you think we can actually start to develop protocols or agreed upon kind of like principles such that these kinds of materials actually could operate with a certain degree of legal probity? Because, or is that impossible when there's so many artisanal practices happening? I don't know what your experience would lead you to reflect upon in that regard, because I think there's a big gap between what you're doing and then what sort of legal mechanisms then have to actually deal with. Yes, they can bring the expert in, but that expertise then can be challenged on so many levels. And once we're actually producing the data synthetically, it seems to open up a really kind of like a Pandora's box from the point of view of the legal. So I just curious about your own reflections.
Yeah, I agree with you that it does raise concern about the competition for truth between synthetic and real or ground truth. A few different things to say in response. One is that the synthetic data right now is always very clearly differentiable from a real video or image in its quality, in its histogram, in its artifacts, and in the context, which is entirely lacking. And the, you mentioned something about the admissibility of these images and videos. That is something that's taking a really long time. I've been working on VFrame for a little over almost 5 years, and in that time knew nothing about it at the beginning and learned in the first few years that it's really challenging and it sounds almost impossible, to realizing that because there are so many people working on this and in terms of collecting it and trying to create a legal case, and at the same time so many people publishing, that there has been progress in the legal departments in order to figure out what makes something legally usable. And I think that the name of the app that I've heard, there may be multiple, is called Eyewitness, and that allows for a direct acquisition of legally usable, but it may be different in the UK. It's pretty interesting about speed trap cameras being the only admissible form of an image.
Operated or that you can't challenge.
Yeah. I think to allay concerns about the possibility of synthetic data competing too much, there is a really large gap between the quality of these two. Typically when it comes out of a 3D program, it's so 3D rendered and hyper-realistic that it's way too far in that direction, and then you have to really be an artisanal degrader in order to bring it down to match the target domain. That requires a lot of work. It's also nothing that Hollywood hasn't already done for a long time, and so the possibilities of doing it in other ways have already existed, especially in Photoshop. So what synthetic data does is just it adds more possibilities to that, but I don't think it races the condition too far in order to challenge the legal admissibility, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Maybe just to add something to it, I think technology or practitioners of technology have like a certain tendency to basically like deprive themselves to destroy everything that came before and leave it in the dust. I think it's this kind of like Silicon Valley type of understanding of like what technology means for people and for us and what it is that we are building. And I think this is a problem also, like, I mean, it has been recited often, this like move fast, break things. Like I know there's a technical definition to this and the process, but actually like it's not just this. Like it also, again, like it has a price that we have to pay for this. I think like as technologists, very often we expect everybody to come on our camp. Like everybody basically has to learn everything that we do and approach us and then basically be on the same level with us. And that's also how we talk to people about it. That's what we expect from people. And we as technology, because we get, I don't know, we can charge a lot of money and stuff like this, we are too good to actually like change anything about it. We feel like really empowered at the moment. I think in the area where we are working, I think it is very, very important to introduce simplicity as like really like as a guiding principle when we build technology. If we can really reduce the complexity of the technological systems, then people can understand them. If we like make them like very, very more complicated than they have to be, then like we will lose people in the process. And I think there's a disconnect here, and I think it's also like it's our responsibility as technologists to change this. Like we have to change the way that we speak to people about technology, about the program that we write, about what it can do. Like that we stop using jargon or just like teach just the jargon that is like absolutely required, and like switch around and take over the language that like that the people use that we work with, instead of like that we force them a certain language. I think like if we start doing this, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, I guess, but like I think this would also allow for other people who are not like in our domain, who are not experts, to be able to follow up and make a judgment call about it, even though they're not total experts in the type of work that we're doing.
In adding something short to that, in response to an earlier question you had about the over-interpretation of results from these systems, I think it is easy and often exploited to lend too much credibility to the output of an AI system. And that's why, with computer vision and the example that I showed, it's important to consider both the label and the confidence score together, and that this should constitute the output, not simply I'm not claiming 100% that it is. It's often 90, 80, bouncing around in this range. And you can see just by moving a hand in front of it changes the score. And so, you have to consider both of those. Something maybe 50% RBK 250 because it was totally smashed, but that means it's still 100% RBK. Whereas you could get something that looks like it and it's a different munition, but it just appeared, and it's actually a higher score. Could be 75%, but it's a false positive. So it's very important to include these two output variables together in the interpretation of the computer vision system.
But maybe you know this, Susan, but like, isn't it like in this Anglo-Saxon kind of like law, the fact that if there is some doubt about like the validity of evidence, that it can be dismissed just on the basis of a small amount of doubt?
Yeah, of course, yeah, that's what every prosecutor or defense attorney would try to do, was doubt at the level of how the image was manufactured or how the claim is made. So this is where one needs to account for all the decisions, etc., but also doubt as to the credentials of the expert witness, right? And other cases where they may have found come to different sort of conclusions. So one's record as an expert witness is also what is under like cross-examination. So I think everything is up for grabs, and this is obviously where also the funding that one has access to in terms of the kind of legal representation and the team that would be assisting you would play a kind of crucial role. But yeah, most things that go into courts go as visual aids and aids for testimony. They may eventually make their way through the legal process and become they could be exhibits, but they might actually not become evidential. They're often used to help people narrate what happened, so they don't necessarily have to have the kind of classification of evidence. But sure, everything can be the kind of software that was used. Forensic architecture always gets challenged because our expertise is collective, and that completely defies the way. You can't ask a collective, where did you go to school and receive your training? And and the fact that there are artists and architects as part of the team also has been consistently has been a consistent kind of pushback at they don't really have the expertise to be making these kinds of like investigative claims. So yes, of course, I think I would say that's the primary, one of the kind of key objectives of legal practitioners is to produce doubt, right? Yeah.
Last thing, because I find this a very interesting thing, and like a few years ago I was like really faced with this dilemma of like how can you collect publicly available data and have it forensically valid, like specifically for court cases. And it's like, I mean, we did some things, but it was like we didn't crack it really, right? Like, I mean, just a little bit maybe. And I think it's a principle, I would say a weak point at the moment that we have in the field of data investigation, that we until now did not manage or just made very little inroads into this legal system. But I think maybe also one of the reasons why that is because like we don't have like legal experts on our team, basically. I think there could be also something like this, like every encounter that I had with legal entities, it was always more like a type of service provider. Like we provided a service to them, but we were like separated and they just basically told us what they wanted and the way they wanted it. And I think this doesn't work. Like as soon as you are entering the position of being a service provider, you're losing this insight that you would require to actually transcend this relationship. And I think that would be maybe like a very interesting step to take to like really like sit together on this.
I just ask Christo a quick question. It's a bit related. It's because it's around the concept of negative evidence. So we just talked a little bit about doubt, but I find it so fascinating. And I was thinking about a lawyer friend of mine who worked on the extra rendition flights, and the redacted documents used a very old system, and so they actually like measured the amount of black because the layout of letters that were used in the documents had specific spacings, and they were able to start to decipher the words because of this sort of, in some way it was a less sort of automated form of redaction that. And the same with those white squares. And I'm wondering, like, I'm guessing that someone would have had to go in and manually mask those. So there's, in some way, there's this, what I would call like artisanal or like sort of handmade kind of quality to some of these older forms of negative evidence. And I guess yeah, it's just, I find it really provocative to think about the ways in which automation may be closing down this kind of possibility, because it's these little handmade intercessions that have actually created the kind of entry points for the investigators. Yeah.
I don't think there was a big question here, but I think like exploitation is an interesting aspect, and like investigators exploit often a situation, like a certain scenario, and it just presents themselves and they take advantage of it, and that's what they're doing. Like I think like just going back, this exploitation of like we exploited the censorship implementation on biomaps, like that was an exploitation of like the way they implemented censorship, and that allowed it for us to actually start with this research. I tried to run my program like a few months after that. I did the data collection and it was not working anymore. The thing is like I didn't bother anymore to look at it, why it didn't work. It could be a very small thing. I don't think it was like anything on purpose. It's just like the nature of technological development means things change perpetually. And I think that's just what happened. But it's this like exploitation that's like something that, for example, like open source intelligence is like really famous for. It's like really clever hacks and tricks to exploit a certain like scenario that presents itself. But this is generally interesting, but it's only one aspect of data investigation, I would say.
Wondering regarding, just to close the circle here, regarding your first question about the radar cameras that capture car, what's the name, placas, matrículas, license plates, exactly. If the legal validity of that outcome doesn't come from the technical side, but from the administrative side, in the sense that the only people able to use them are the police.
What I've been told is that there are agreed upon understandings of how the technology works, and it has to work consistently in every single jurisdiction. But so it's those agreed upon principles about how you translate from, say, the data captured by a satellite sensor, it's not consistent across all the different commercial satellite providers. But so there's basically, I think what we're talking about in the UK is standardization of technology. So if there was, if Wales, England, Scotland were using different systems, no, but I think it's precisely because the technology is completely standardized and there's agreement as to how the translation between the capture of data to what you ultimately get as an image, that those have been completely kind of in some way agreed upon. That's what I've been told by the people who study this, but...
Makes total sense, but isn't that defined by the fact that only police in every country can use it? Like it doesn't have any commercial uses, doesn't have any alternative users?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a form of automated image capture. I don't know whether it's exclusive to the police, but I mean, I don't, and I'm not saying it's globally the same. I'm just saying in the UK, it's the only image that has any legal traction, which I find kind of, it's such a domesticated image, and it's the only one that actually can stand up in court, and no one can dispute that image. But yeah, anyway, I don't know more than that, to be perfectly honest. Yeah.
Just like one thing, like I find this idea of standardization at the moment very interesting. It's an interesting word because, like, I mean, I can just tell from my tools, like my tools don't work consistent. I don't think I ever aimed to do this, and I wonder if at this moment in time, with the field developing as it is, if standardization at the moment is a right call or not. I'm not sure, like I really don't know, but like I found it very interesting thought of like, as data investigators, do we have to standardize or not in order to make this happen? Is it important enough? And is it worth enough that we actually go this process? Because we would also lose a lot of things. Again, like I don't have an education and I'm not licensed to do anything, right? So if there would be a standard around it, would I be still able to do this kind of work? And would other people like me that follow up or something would be able to get into this field? And that's like, of course, a trade-off. And I wonder, I find this an interesting thought, like is that something that we should consider or not? Yeah.
Activists aren't necessarily interested in the legal admissibility of them, but they're interested in like public advocacy, et cetera, et cetera. So I would agree with you. I think if producing something that's legally robust, I think would really foreclose a lot of activities in relationship to questions of justice and intervention into human rights violations. So I think we definitely can't be thinking just using the framework of sort of law as our guiding principles, because activism would have no place, because activism has to repurpose tools and strategies and methods, can't possibly be completely loyal to standardization, I would argue. Needs to do almost the opposite, yeah.
Well, what you're saying, it makes total sense. Like, we're not in the game. So to use the corset of legal statutes, I guess, is just not particularly useful. That's what you're saying.
Well, I'm just saying, I mean, the law is so like arcane, peculiar, has all these rules, procedures that, yeah, if that's the arena that you want to operate in, then you in some way don't have a choice but to, I think, but you talk to lawyers, they want to also push at the limits of the law and change and radicalize the law too. Of course, we recognize it's straitjacket, if you will, right? I'm just saying that I think, no, I don't agree with standardization, regulation, these regulatory regimes that would reduce everything, because then they would presumably just be subject to governance by large multinational corporations. They're already determining. Like I work in a university where Microsoft runs absolutely everything. You know, it's like, that's a form of standardization in higher education, I would say, in the UK, at the level of our software and platform providers, etc.
Yep, same here. Same here in Spain. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? No? See? No? I have a question.
Yes, there is a question from the Media Lab chat. From Alfonso. Sorry. Sorry, I can read it right now. Now, okay. From Alfonso FR, other possible application of this text are here. They are using it to detect possible malaria hotspot to Adam.
Does it say malaria hotspots?
Hotspots. I don't know.
Can you detect malaria hotspot?
If you could model like the mosquitoes and then search for them.
I'm not quite sure of the question, but can it detect
Malaria hotspot?
Yeah, from visual images of people documenting bug bites or something? Well, that's not something that I do, but that is a big topic in computer vision, is analyzing, skin conditions, and Google has recently released a tool. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but if that was the question, the answer is that Google has recently released a tool to do something very similar to that, and it's in beta, and it looks quite impressive, though I wonder where they got all the data.
An early app whose promise, I would say, because I don't believe it was doing actually what it said it was doing, it was to use its microphone to detect the background noise of mosquitoes that could, in fact, have like malaria, and or just the kind of mosquitoes that carry it, which would require a kind of mic that I think is not the sort that we have in our phones, or at least I hope it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, that gets into maybe I'll take that question and run with it a little bit, because there are, super or subhuman frequencies that can't be perceived in audio, that can be exploited in ultrasonic, maybe the one with mosquitoes, that can be picked up by the MEMS microphones on phones, but it's something that we can't hear.
Would the mosquito have to be to the phone?
Well, I guess you almost always have your phone on you, so yeah, it might have to be quite close or very quiet and not work in an urban area. But running with this question a little bit, you can think also about the change in resolution that's happened in photography. So I'm bringing the question back into my wheelhouse a little bit here, because what is interesting, and the example that I brought up before, is that when resolution changes enough, it's a different scenario, almost entirely. And the models that you train, or the technology that you develop for the way that a photo appears in 2013 might be a lot different than 2022. And for example, going back to what I showed in the slides, is that the very first face detection algorithm, called the car cascade by Viola and Jones, was developed in, I believe, 2003 or 2001, and there were no 4K camera phones at that time. So a lot of the imagery was 640 by 480 CCTV, quite grainy, low quality, slightly blurry footage, and that was used to train. So the encoded definition of what a face looked like was quite soft and blurry, and it didn't have any texture to it. And that's why the project that I did worked, is because you can simply block out or inverse and reverse these like very blocky facial features. That's why the makeup attack worked on it, because there was no texture encoded into it. There also was no color information encoded. It was a grayscale image. And that's because the microprocessors at the time just couldn't handle that much information. So what, the big difference is now that deep neural networks do encode color information, because you have more processing power. So both the processing power for understanding the image and exploiting differences in it and the resolution of the image are increasing a lot. So the smartphones that everyone has in this room are probably at least 10 megapixels. And compare that to the original resolution of a image used to train the first face detection at 640 by 480, and then think 10 years into the future.
Do you have any questions left? Because I have one. So you've been working closely with Catalan artist Joana Moll, and also with her, I was going to say business partner, her art partner, Vlad Anjoler, and they've been working a lot on themes related to the cloud. Where is it? How much energy it consumes, etc. And while I was seeing your presentation, I was thinking how easy it would be to use the same protocols to find the clouds all over Europe, because strangely, we don't know where they are. I mean, we would know if we had access to the electricity bills in certain places, of course, but we don't. So another way of, like, you know, locating all these spaces would definitely be the way you used to. Because, I mean, while you were showing the defining qualities that help you search for these installations, I was remembering that some years ago I gave a talk saying that the only infrastructure that is similar to the data centers is in fact the detention center. They have the same qualities, even the same kind of protection from outsiders and blocking the insiders from coming out, no? And so I was wondering, did you ever, or have you ever done that research, or would you, maybe?
The easy answer I can give, no, I've never done any kind of research in this area. So the work that, for example, Joana Moll does, it's super interesting because it looks very strongly at the ecological aspects of technology. And while I'm personally super, super interested in this, and I think it's also really relevant to the type of work that I'm doing, I know very little about it, like, to be honest. But I do think that when we build technology, we have to consider this as well. Like again, like this comes back to this statement about like every technology we build also has like a trade-off, and like one trade-off that we always have to consider now, like just also out of an ethical reason, is like the environmental impact. Like the way that we build our tools and our systems and our platforms and infrastructures, like we have to consider this. Like there is no free lunch anymore regarding this. Like it's over. We can't ignore it anymore, basically. So that's why I think the work that Joana Moll, Vlad Anjoler do is like, that's why it's so super interesting and powerful. Like in terms of like, could you find like data centers? So I think there's probably like other ways that would be like easier, like company reports, filings to stock exchanges and stuff like this, because there is a certain like transparency to data centers, because like while they maybe like aesthetically could look similar, they are different to detention centers. There's a whole different like habitus around data centers, and that's why like I think there would be other avenues that would be maybe easier and more straightforward. The question is also like, how complete do you want to do this? Like, do you want to find every data center, or is it good enough for you to find like, I don't know, like 90% of the data centers? Or like that's like always the question, and I think depending on the answer, your methodology might change, and that's, I think, so I would not, on the spot, I would not know how to approach it, but I think like my first instinct would be to look at data, releases of data that already exist before you try to generate a new data set and see if there's something there or if it's enough. Like.
All right, one question.
Thank you for your presentation. It was phenomenal. I have a question for you, Christo. A lot of the data that you've collected, you know, of the Uyghur concentration camps and the photographs and the evidence even when it was confirmed, I don't imagine there would be a jurisdiction where you could trial this. So in a way, the output of this is through the media sphere and through influencing perhaps public opinion, I imagine mostly outside of China. How do you see your work playing, a part of advocacy or transforming the situation that it represents?
So there has been actually an attempt to bring the situation in Xinjiang to the ICC, and I think just like half a year ago or something, the ICC turned it down at the moment. They basically said at the moment we cannot follow it, but like we are open if there's more evidence down the road that we might open up the case again. So the people who were pushing for this court case, we were in contact with them and we shared our data with them. Generally, the data that we published, that we spoke publicly about, it's accessible and available, and you can download it like as a CSV file, just like the raw data, basically. In terms of like, what was the second part of the question? I apologize.
The role of your work. Sorry,
yeah.
I gave this back too early.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like advocacy is not what I do, and I don't think I would be very good at it either. Like, but I think like I am interested in like other people doing this. Like I always like saw my own position as I have certain skills and other people can use them to good effect, I think. But like I always need like also like a driver, like as I said, like, so I think advocacy is super interesting, but of course like I am interested in human rights, and human rights is also a legal concept. And while I'm not a super fan of like this blind thinking in law terms. I think it lacks a lot of things. Like in terms of human rights, there are some very interesting aspects to it, and I personally would like to see like that the legal system or the human rights courts could use data more than they do now. Like, so there are some attempts, and there has been some precedents based on social media, but this was mostly social media where people generated evidence by themselves about themselves. So somebody posted a picture of themselves in front of a dead body or something like this and claimed the act. So that was a very different case, of course. I think that there is more there, and I think like for human rights on a bigger scale, I think there would be a lot in there if there could be like more connections. But I personally, I don't have these connections yet. I think one problem, of course, is that open source, or not open source, publicly available data has just some legal issues. Like if you bring this to a court, it's very hard to prove that like where you got this from, who had it, like you have no chain of custody for data, like, and this makes like everything like much harder. So I think there's also something to be said about like that courts have to basically tell us like maybe a possibility of like how we can make it possible. And I think there has been an attempt recently, I think Bellingcat was it, that made like a mock trial in order to like to test a court or like a court situation to see how far they can get, and I think the results were a little bit mixed. But I think like it would be interesting to see if you can push it further and what would be required. But I'm also not convinced that this would be the only avenue. I think the field is broad and it's generally applicable, and not everything needs like a legal recourse. And I think there's a lot of space where you can like use data with different qualities or attributes and still basically have them like fit for purpose.
Sorry. Just a quick follow-up, sorry. I mean, I think we're in a moment when we're saying something quite interesting, is that basically every state is scrambling to see, what role does it take, in international courts, and, what does it even mean? So, for instance, when we saw in Ukraine that, the Russian army was using thermobaric weapons, this was, originally, kept in secret, but then, or they wound up admitting that they were using it, and they're not signatories, of the treaties that prohibit this. So how does it work in terms of, truth-telling? I think we're in a strange moment when I think a lot of taboos about, and that may be more directed towards your practice, actually, but where a lot of taboos about weapons that are forbidden by the laws of war, for instance, are being, melted, like right in front of our eyes. So, I mean, where do we go from this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tension between the capabilities of what technology can do, the reality of what's true, and then the actual legal process and how slow and challenging that can be, and that the ICC is maybe not the right place for all of these, and many of them will not go anywhere, and there will be no justice for a lot of people. I think it's easy, yeah, unfortunately, but this shouldn't prevent any of the projects from moving forward. I think it's quite easy to get discouraged with this work, especially if you spend years working on something, looking at terrible footage and probably undergoing some psychological trauma, and you don't even know if anything is going to happen. Yet there are a lot of people doing this, and just with the hope that it might be possible, makes it still worth it. And I think that people working in the legal areas, they want to catch up, and there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and they can't be answered that quickly. So in the meantime, developing these tools, but trying to do so in the most responsible way, and getting feedback, doing trials, not racing them out the door, working, I'm not unhinged technologist in my project. I'm working, grounding myself with the advice of both experts who understand the objects and the human rights researchers, and trying to understand this legal process that's come up a lot tonight in order to guide what it is that I do. So I went through years of prototyping in order to figure out what kind of tool would help the process, and the process that the researchers are doing is guided by, that's a top-down kind of causality from ICC. Once you understand that, you can like reverse engineer this algorithm from a technologist standpoint into what types of data, what types of algorithms can then push it back in the other direction, upwards.
I'm not sure how we are on time.
Very quick.
Very quick.
My
answers are very quick always. Like when we always talked about like court, law, and justice, we always actually like implied that it's punitive justice, and I think that's maybe also something to consider. That while I do think it's interesting to like understand this area better, I think there's like different form of justices that exist as well, and I think like maybe it would be a chance to focus more on those things. Like when I was working in the Syrian archive, like I was always looking at this data and I thought like, wow, I mean, what's going to happen with this, right? And I always thought like, well, the really huge value of this archive is actually for the generations to follow. And like when these generations have to like work through like what happened in Syria, and like if like any form of like justice or reconciliation has to happen, like then these data collections, these processes that we establish now are going to be extremely valuable, because of course like before you can like put something to rest or like come to terms with something, you also have to be able to name it. And if we can't name it, that's a problem. And I think that's something that we also saw in Europe, like after the Second World War, like the inability to name things was really like an issue. And I think like of course data allows us to basically like to find the visual imagery in order to name something. And I think part of this work, when we talk about justice, I think we should like really focus maybe also as practitioners on the area of transitional justice. I think there would be more there where we can have like a higher impact than maybe punitive justice systems.
All right. Well, all your other questions in the bar, please. Gracias por haber venido y por haber aguantado con nosotros hasta ahora. Thank you so much, Cristo, and thank you, Adam, for coming to Madrid. It's such a pleasure to have you here, hopefully the first of many visits. And gracias a todos, again.
Thank